The most accepted line of thought is that the first men were the first humans to inhabit Westeros, crossing over from Essos over the lost land bridge that makes up the island chain known as the Stepstones. But there are some who have put forward a different idea, that the first men may not have truly have been the first. Before their coming, it was believed that Westeros was the realm of giants, the children of the forests, and other beasts lost to time. But on the Iron Islands, on the western coast of Westeros in the Sunset Sea, the priests of the drowned gods tell a very different story to the one well known on the mainland. According to them, the Ironborn are in fact a separate race of men, apart from the common run of mankind seen on the mainland of Westeros. The famous priest Sauron Salttongue once said the following: "We do not come to these holy islands from the godless lands across the sea. We came from beneath the seas, from the watery halls of the drowned god, who made us in his likeness, and gave us dominion over all of the waters of the earth." Even among the Ironborn themselves, there are many who doubt this claim, and acknowledge the more widely accepted view of an ancient descendant of the first men being the first Ironborn, even though it's known that the first men were not in fact seafaring people, like the Andals whom would follow them to Westeros thousands of years later. There is no proof of the claim of the Ironborn's most devout followers of the drowned god, who still this day believe that the Ironborn are closer kin to fish and merlings than the other races of mankind. There is even a wild theory that rejects the widely accepted first men origin of the Ironborn, and even the theories of the followers of the drowned god. An archmaester of the Citadel, known as Harlaw, once proposed an interesting idea that the ancestors of the Ironborn may have come from some unknown land west of the Sunset Sea, citing the old legends of the Sea Stone Chair. This throne of House Greyjoy, which is carved into the shape of a kraken, made with some strange oily black stone very uncommon in Westeros, with only a few similar stones known to us, such as the base of the High Tower in Old Town, which is believed to predate the building of the High Tower and Old Town itself. Like the High Tower, the first men who came to Old Wyk found the oily stone on their arrival. Archmaester Harlaw puts forward the idea that it was the true first inhabitants of the Iron Islands who made this chair, and only later histories of the Citadel and Septons begin to attribute it to the first men. But the truth is, this is all just speculation, and even Archmaester Harlaw notes his ideas are just that, speculation of a possible theory. In truth, how the Ironborn arose does not matter in the modern era of Westeros, because regardless, it cannot be denied that they do stand apart from the mainland, with their customs, beliefs, and way of governance making them quite unlike those common in other kingdoms of Westeros. As Archmaester Harlaw puts forward in his Histories of the Ironborn, it all stems from religion. The cold, damp, and windy islands that make up the Iron Islands have never boasted anything akin to the forests of the mainland. Their soil is thin and could not support farming, let alone the growth of weirwood trees that are crucial to the religion of the first men. No giants ever made their homes on the islands, nor did the children of the forests in the few woods the islands do possess. Thus the old gods worshipped by the elder races and the first men were completely absent. Even when the Andals did reach the Iron Islands, their faith never took hold like it did in the mainland. As for the Ironborn, one god had always come before the old gods or the seven, the drowned god, creator of Dea, and father of the Ironborn. Unlike the old gods or the faith of the seven, the drowned god has no temples, no holy texts, nor idols of his likeness, but the one thing he does have is priests. Since before there was a recorded history, these devout holy men spread the word of their god across the Iron Islands, preaching the word of the drowned god and denouncing all other gods and men who follow them. Poorly dressed, unkempt, barefoot, the priests of the drowned gods tend not to have a permanent home, but wander the islands following the will of their god, never straying too far from the sea. Most are said to not know how to read, as their traditions are of a spoken word, with younger priests learning the prayers and rituals from an elder, with the knowledge passed down over generations. Wherever a priest may wander, the lords and small folk alike are obliged to give them food and shelter in the name of the drowned god. Most priests will only eat fish or food from the sea, and only bathe in the sea itself. Men from the mainland, when meeting a priest of the drowned god for the first time, often think them to be mad, as they might rightly appear, but it cannot be denied they wield great power over the islands. While most of the Ironborn scorn or mock the faith of the Seven and the old gods of the north, they do recognise a second, less known deity, with the drowned god being opposed by the storm god, who is a malignant dwelling in the skies, hating men and all their works, sending cruel and harsh winds, lashing rains and thunder and lightning as his endless wrath. The job of the priests of the drowned men is to give blessings in the name of the drowned god. Iron men have seawater poured over their heads. A priest will then ask the drowned god to have his servant born again from the sea, as you were, to bless him with salt, and bless him with stone, and bless him with steel. The man being baptized would then respond, "What is dead may never die." Certain followers of priest are known as drowned men. Becoming a drowned man differs from priest to priest, but Aeron Greyjoy makes his drowned men by having them submerged in salt water a second time in earnest, and brought back to life with a kiss of life. Aeron himself has never failed in a resurrection. The drowned men wear rough-spun robes of malted green, grey and blue, the colours of the drowned god. They carry driftwood cudgels to show their devotion in battle, and a skin of salt water to perform ritual anointments, as well to sate their thirst. The faith of the drowned god has several practices that relate back to the idea of the origin of the Ironborn. The most interesting of these practices, from a mainland point of view, is their ritual drowning. Priests of the drowned god are known to purposely drown a man and then bring them back from the dead using what's known as the kiss of life. This is often done as part of a rite consecrating the participant to the drowned god. Not all men are successfully brought back to life with the kiss. If so, they are deemed not worthy. While the priest is giving the kiss of life, his acolytes pray around him. It's often a custom by the most devout of the followers to give a newborn child to the drowned god shortly after birth. The most devout of followers believe that this should be carried out using the same method as the kiss of life, but most, however, believe the child should simply be dipped in a tub of fresh seawater to wet the babe's head. In the same way the priests of the drowned gods have rituals for life, they too have some for death. In fact, there are many different types of ritual execution. Blood sacrifice is done by cutting the throat of a thrall, after which the corpse is given to the sea and the drowned god. It is often also common to drown men in salt water and not give them the kiss of life. When a faithful Ironborn dies, it's often said that the drowned god was in need of a strong oarsman, with the phrase "what is dead may never die" often proclaimed in such an instance. It is believed that the deceased is summoned to the drowned god's watery hall, where they can drink and feast for all of time, with mermaids attending their every want and need. The Ironborn believe that no true son of the sea would ever want to rot in the ground, as it means they would not be able to reach the drowned god's hall. Thus, an Ironborn buried is seen as the ultimate punishment, by refusing them entry into the halls of the drowned god. Priests of the drowned god preach the Ironborn must not shed the blood of other Ironborn, though they believe such methods as drowning are acceptable, as it means that technically no blood is spilled. But the nature of men often means this tenet is more often than not ignored. There are some maesters that claim that the Iron Islands are named for the iron ore that is found there in abundance. While in many ways this is true, the Ironborn themselves have always insisted that the Isles derived its name from the nature of the Ironborn themselves, as they are well regarded as harsh and tough people, as unbending as their god. Regardless of how the names of the Iron Islands or the Ironborn came about, most agree in both cases it's fitting. Cartographers over the centuries tell us that the Iron Islands are made up of 31 islands in the main group off Iron Man's Bay in the Cape of Eagles, with 13 more clustered around the Lonely Light out eastwards, towards the Sunset Sea, with it for countless years thought to be the westernmost land known to us, until Alyssa Farwynd discovered 3 small islands she named Egon, Visanya and Rhaenys, further out. But of these many islands, there are 7 large enough to host sizable populations: Old Wyk, Great Wyk, Pyke, Harlaw, Saltcliffe, Blacktyde and Orkmont. Many Westerosi not familiar with the islands often assume that the seat of House Greyjoy on Pyke is the most populous of the islands. It is in fact Harlaw, with Great Wyk being the largest by size, and with the amount of valuable ore it possesses. Old Wyk is also considered to be the holiest place in the Iron Islands, the location where the kings of Salton Rock once gathered in the grey halls of old to choose who would reign over the Ironborn. Rugged and mountainous, Orkmont was once home to the Iron Kings of House Greyjoy in the centuries long since past, whom are believed to have gone extinct sometime before the Andal invasion of Westeros. Pyke, while one of the smaller islands, does boast the largest town within the Iron Islands, known as Lordsport. Currently the seat of House Botley, Lordsport is a trading hub with mainland Westeros and beyond, with goods from as far as Asshai by the Shadow in the far east of Essos reaching the port at great cost. Lordsport itself does most of its trade with Lannisport and Oldtown, and has often been used as a staging ground for countless Ironborn raiders to gather before striking the shores of the mainland. Pyke is also the seat of House Greyjoy. Ever since the downfall of Harren Hoare during Aegon's conquest, who was burned alive by Aegon in his great castle of Harrenhal in the Riverlands, House Greyjoy has ruled over the Iron Islands, sworn to House Targaryen. But regardless, countless times over the centuries, different Lord Reapers of Pyke took opportunities, often during civil wars, to strike at the mainland. Both the islands of Blacktyde and Saltcliffe are less notable. The tower keeps of lesser lords stand on some of the smaller islands beside minuscule fishing villages. Others are simply used for grazing sheep and goats, while many more remain uninhabited. There is a secondary island grouping that lies 8 days' sail to the northwest in the Sunset Sea. There is still much debate given how remote and far off these islands are if we should really be counting them as part of Westeros. However, the Ironborn claim dominion over them, and thus they are part of the Iron Islands. Much of the island group is nothing more than smatterings of rocks where seals and sea lions make their rookeries, or windswept rocks too small to even support a single household. On the largest rock stands the keep of House Farwynd, named the Lonely Light for the beacon that blazes atop its roof day and night. Very queer things are said of the Farwynds and the small folk they rule. Some say they lie with seals to bring forth half-human children, while others whisper they are skin changers who can take the form of sea lions, walruses, and even spotted whales, the wolves of the western seas. Not much is known about this small piece of Westeros and its history, but what we do know is 1,000 years after the time of King Brandon the Burner, Ironborn sailing out of Great Wyk were blown off course to the cluster of islands 8 days' sail from the closest shore. Their captain built a tower and a beacon there, and took the name Farwynd, and declared the Lonely Light his seat. There House Farwynd have remained ever since. Strange towers like that are common at the edge of the world, and the Lonely Light stands furthest west of all known land to us until recent history. Many bold sailors have sailed beyond the light's beacon over the centuries, seeking the fabled paradises that lie over the horizon. But the sailors who returned, out of the many who do not, speak only of the boundless grey ocean stretching on forever. Such few riches as the Iron Islands possess lie under the hills of Great Wyk, Harlaw and Orkmont, where lead, tin and iron can be found in abundance, rivaling that of the richest veins in the mainland. These ores are the chief export of the islands. There are many fine metalworkers amongst the Ironborn as well, as might be expected. The forges of Lordsport produce swords, axes and ringmail, and plate second to none, with some on the mainland prizing Ironborn steel. The soil of the Iron Islands is thin and stony, more suitable for grazing goats than raising crops. The Ironborn would surely suffer famine every winter, but for the endless bounty of the sea and the fisherfolk who reap it. But some still do struggle with making a living from farming. The waters of Ironman's Bay are home to great schools of cod, black cod, monkfish, skate, icefish, sardines and mackerel. Crabs and lobsters are found along the shores of all of the islands, and west of Great Wyk, swordfish, seals and whales roam the Sunset Sea. Archmaester Hake, born and raised on the island of Harlaw, estimates that 7 of every 10 families on the Iron Islands are fisherfolk. However mean and poor these men might be upon land, at sea they are their own masters. The man who owns a boat never needs to be a thrall, Hake writes. For every captain is a king upon the deck of his own ship. It is their catches that feed the islands. Yet even more than fishermen, Ironborn esteem their reavers, the wolves of the sea. The men of the Westerlands and the Riverlands named them in days of yore, and rightly so. Like wolves, they often hunted in packs, crossing the stormy seas in their swift longships, and descending upon the peaceful villages and towns upon the shores of the Sunset Sea to raid, rob, and pillage. Fearless sailors and fearsome fighters, they would appear out of the morning mists to do their bloody work, and be back at sea before the sun had reached its zenith. The longships laden with plunder, and crowded with wailing children and frightened women, taken back as prisoners and salt wives. Archmaester Harreg has argued that it was a need for wood that first set the Ironborn on this bloody path. In the great dawn of days, there was an extensive forest on Great Wyk, Harlaw, and Orkmont, but the shipwrights of the islands had such ferocious needs for timber that one by one these woods vanished. So the Ironborn had no choice but to turn to the vast forests of the Green Lands, the mainland of Westeros. There are many places across the Seven Kingdoms of Westeros that are hard places to live, and these hard environments in turn breed hard men, unlike those who make up the more general population. From the Dornish in the arid deserts to the Crannog men in the swamps of the Neck, like the Ironborn, they have all been shaped by their environment. But this hard lifestyle, brought on by the very lands these men need to live, had created a people who see this hardship as a matter of honour and pride, and thus viewing others who live a more comfortable life as soft and weak. So while the Ironborn themselves have been shaped by the harsh and testing islands, so too in a way have the Ironborn shaped what the islands have become. Reaving is as much a part of the Ironborn culture as the drowned god himself, carrying off plunder, women and children from the seaside towns that mark the coast of the Sunset Sea, a brutal way of life for both the Ironborn and their targets. Some have put forward the idea that it was the sheer lack of resources, specifically wood, that sent the Ironborn down this bloody path. Near all of what the Iron Islands lacked, reavers could find in abundance in the Green Lands to the east. Little and less was taken in trade with these people, and much was brought in blood, with the point of a sword or an axe. When the reavers returned back to the islands with their plunder, they would say that they had paid the iron price for it. Those who stayed behind and benefited from their work were said to have paid the gold price, or thus went without. And thus, as Maester Harreg tells us, reavers and their deeds were held in the highest esteem by singers, small folk and lords alike. Many legends have come down to us through the millennia of the Salt Kings and reavers who made the Sunset Sea their own. Men as wild and cruel and fearless as any who have ever lived. Thus we hear the likes of Torgon the Terrible, Jarl the Whale, Dagon Drum, the Necromancer, Horgoth of Pyke, and his kraken-summoning horn, and Ragget Ralph of Old Wyk. Most infamous of all was Balon Blackskin, who fought with his axe in his left hand and a hammer in his right. No weapon made of man could harm him, it was said. Swords glanced off and left no mark, and axes shattered against his skin. Did such men ever truly walk the earth? It's hard to know, since most supposedly lived and died thousands of years before the Ironmen learnt to write, with literacy still remaining a rare trait in the Iron Islands to this day, and those who possessed the skill often mocked as weaklings or feared as sorcerers. So much of what we know of these demigods of the Dawn Age comes to us from the people they plundered and preyed upon, written in the old tongue and in the runes of the first men. The lands the reavers plundered were densely wooded, but thinly populated in those days, some even so to this day. Then as in now, the Ironborn were reluctant to go too far from the salt waters that sustained them, but they ruled the Sunset Sea from Bear Island in the north and the frozen shores, right down to the Arbor in the summer sea. The feeble fishing boats and trading cogs of the first men, which seldom ventured out of sight of land, were no match for the swift, long ships of the Ironmen, with their great sails and banks of oars, and when battle was joined upon the shore, mighty kings and famous warriors fell before the reavers, like wheat before a scythe, in such numbers that the men of the Green Lands told each other that the Ironborn were demons, risen from some watery hell, protected by fell sorceries and possessed of foul, black weapons that drank the very souls of those they slew. Thus reaving became a way of life for the Ironborn. Whenever autumn waned and winter threatened, the longships would come raiding after food, and so the Iron Islands ate, even in the depths of winter, whilst often as not, the men who had planted, tended and harvested their own crops starved. "We do not sow" became the boast of the Greyjoys, whose rulers began to style themselves the Lord Reapers of Pyke. The truth is, these reavers brought back more than gold and grain to the Iron Islands. They brought back captives as well, whom would henceforth serve their captors as thralls. Amongst the Ironborn, only reaving and fishing were considered worthy work for a free man. The endless stoop of labour of farms and fields was only suitable for thralls. The same was true for mining, yet those thralls who were set to field work counted themselves as fortunate. Maester Harrick writes, "For many and more of them lived to grow old, and were even allowed to marry and have children. Such could not be said of those condemned to work in the mines, those dark, dangerous pits beneath the hills, where the masters were brutal, the air was dank and foul, and life was short." Most of the male captives brought back to the Iron Islands spent the remainder of their lives at hard labour in the fields or mines. Some few, the sons of lords and knights and rich merchants, were ransomed for gold. Thralls who could read, write and do sums served their masters as stewards, tutors and scribes. Stonemasons, cordwainers, coppers, chandlers, carpenters, and other skilled craftsmen were more valuable. Thraldom was also common practice amongst the first men during their long domination over Westeros, further supporting the idea that the Ironborn had descended from the first men. Further, thraldom should not be conflated with chattel slavery as it exists in certain of the free cities and lands further east. Unlike slaves, thralls retain certain important rights. A thrall belongs to his captor and owes him his service and obedience, but he is still a man, not property. Thralls cannot be bought or sold. They may own property, marry as they wish, have children. The children of thralls are born free. Any babe born on one of the Iron Islands is considered Ironborn, even when both of his parents are thralls. Nor will such children be taken from their parents until the age of 7, when most begin apprenticeships or join a ship's crew. Most of all, it was the young women that the reavers prized the most. Older women were sometimes carried off by those captains in need of scullions, cooks, seamstresses, weavers, midwives, and that like. But fair maidens and girls, nearer their first flowering, were taken on every raid. Most ended their days upon the Iron Islands as serving girls, whores, household drudges, or wives to other thralls, but the fairest and strongest would be kept as salt wives by their captors. In their marriage customs, as in their god, the Ironborn differ from the mainland of Westeros. Wherever the faith prevails in the Seven Kingdoms, a man joins himself for life to a single wife, and a maid to one husband. On the Iron Islands, however, a man may have only one rock wife, unless she should die, whereupon he may take another, but any number of salt wives. A rock wife must be a freeborn woman of the Iron Islands. Her place is at her man's side in board and bed, and her children come before all others. Salt wives are almost always women and girls captured during raids. The number of salt wives the man can support speaks to his power, wealth and virility. It must not be thought that salt wives of the Iron Islands are no more than concubines, whores or bed slaves. Salt marriage, like rock marriage, were customarily performed by priests of the drowned god, albeit in ceremonies considerably less solemn than those that bind a man to his rock wife. Thus, the children of such unions were considered legitimate. Salt sons may even inherit when a man has no true-born sons by his rock wife. Salt marriage has declined notably on the Iron Islands since the conquest, as Aegon the Conqueror made the stealing of women a crime throughout the Seven Kingdoms at the urging of his queen, Rhaenys. The Conqueror also forbade the reavers to prey upon his own domains. These prohibitions have only been sporadically enforced under his successors, and many Ironborn still yearn to return to what they call the old way. Back in the Age of Heroes, where much of what we know is from stories and legends, the Ironborn say they were ruled by a mighty and powerful king, simply known as the Grey King. It is said the Grey King ruled the sea itself and took a mermaid to wife, so that his sons and daughters might live on land and beneath the waves as they choose. His hair and beard and eyes were as grey as the winter sea, and from there it is said he took his name. In some variations of the tale, it is said that the crown he wore was made of driftwood, so that all who knelt before him might know that his kingship came from the sea, and the drowned god himself, who dwells beneath the waves in his watery halls. The deeds attributed to the Grey King by priests and singers of the Iron Islands are many, with most of them fantastical and marvellous. It was said that it was the Grey King who brought fire to the earth by taunting the storm god until in his anger he lashed down a thunderbolt which set a tree ablaze. The Grey King is also claimed to have taught men to weave nets and sails and how to carve the first longships from hard pale wood of Yag, a demonic tree who feasted on the flesh of men. But by far, the Grey King's greatest feat was the slaying of Naga, the largest of the sea dragons, a beast so large she was said to have fed on leviathans and giant krakens, drowning whole islands in her wrath. After defeating Naga, the Grey King built a mighty long hall around her bones, using ribs as beams and rafters. From there he ruled the Iron Islands for 1,000 years, until his skin turned as grey as his hair. Only then did he cast his driftwood crown aside and walk into the sea, descending to the ground god's watery hall to take his place at his right hand. The Grey King is the first Ironborn king to have laid claim over the Iron Islands. He left 100 sons behind him upon his death, and they began to quarrel over who would succeed him. Brother would kill brother in a chaos of kinslaying, until only 16 sons remained. The last sons divided the Iron Islands between them. All of the great houses of the Ironborn claimed descent from the Grey Kings and his sons, with oddly only the Goodbrothers of Old Wyk and Great Wyk, who supposedly descend from the Grey King's eldest brother. The tale of the Grey King is of course popular among the Ironborn, and is often preached by the priests of the drowned god. However, how much of this is true, much like anything from the Age of Heroes, is another matter altogether. We do know that the petrified bones of some gigantic sea creature do indeed stand on Naga's Hill on Old Wyk, but whether they are actually the bones of a sea dragon remain open to dispute. The ribs are indeed huge, but nowhere near as large to have belonged to a dragon capable of feasting on leviathans and giant krakens. In truth, the very existence of sea dragons has also been called into question by some. If such monsters do exist, they must surely dwell in the deepest, darkest reaches of the Sunset Sea, for none have been seen in the known world for thousands of years. In terms of recorded history, well, it does tell a tale of its own. The oldest surviving records at the Citadel in Old Town tell us that each of the Iron Islands was once a separate kingdom, ruled by not one single king, but in fact two, a Rock King and a Salt King. The former ruled the islands itself, dispensing justice, making laws, and settling disputes. The latter commanded at sea, whenever and wherever the island's longships sailed. Surviving records do suggest that the Rock Kings were almost always older than the Salt Kings. In some cases, the two were father and son, which has led some to argue that the Salt Kings were more so heirs, crown princes to their fathers. There are other instances known to us where the Rock King and Salt King were of different houses, sometimes even rival houses, known to be inimical to one another. However, how this worked in practice is not known to us. But clearly this unusual arrangement did happen, and clearly worked in practice for some time, for us indeed to have records of it in the Citadel, whom would only in turn have kept these records if there was some basis in truth to them. Elsewhere in Westeros, petty kings claimed crowns of gold by virtue of birth and blood, but the driftwood crowns of the Ironborn were not so easily won. Here alone in all of Westeros, men made their own kings, assembling in great councils called Kingsmoots to choose the Rock Kings and the Salt Kings who would rule over them. Whenever a king died, the priest of the drowned gods would call a Kingsmoot to choose their successor. Every man who owned and captained a boat was allowed a voice at these unruly gatherings, which often went on for days, and in a few instances, far longer. The Ironborn also tell of occasions where the priests called the captains and kings together to remove an unworthy ruler. such as the power of the priests of the Drowned God. The power wielded by these prophets of the Drowned God over the Ironborn should not be underestimated. While yes, they certainly have less power than they once did, as history shows us, for many followers of the Drowned God, they were placed higher than the kings themselves. Only the priests could summon a Kingsmoot, and could not be coerced into doing so by other means than their own free will. When the Kingsmoot was called, woe to the man, be he lord or king, who dared defy them. The greatest of these priests was the towering prophet known as Gallan Whitestaff, so called for the tall carved staff he carried everywhere to smite the ungodly. In some tales, his staff was made of weirwood, in others from one of Naga's bones. It was Gallan who decreed that the Ironborn must not make a war on other Ironborn, who forbade them from carrying off each other's women or raid each other's shores, and who forged the Iron Islands into a single kingdom, summoning the captains and kings to Old Wyk to choose a High King to reign supreme over the Salt Kings and the Rock Kings alike. They chose House Greyjoy, called Ironfoot, the Salt King of Orkmont, and most fearsome reaver of the age. Gallan himself placed the Driftwood crown upon the High King's head, and Horace Ironfoot became the first man since the Great King to rule over all of the Ironborn. The first High King of the Iron Islands was chosen at a Kingsmoot, Horace Greyjoy of Orkmont, known as Ironfoot, the most feared reaver of his age. When the Driftwood crown was placed upon his head, he became not only the first High King of the Ironborn, but the first since the Grey King himself ruled over the islands. Many years later, when Horace Ironfoot died of wounds sustained while reaving, his eldest son seized the crown and proclaimed himself King Eric I. Though half-blind and feeble with age by that time, Gallan Whitestaff, the High Priest of the Drowned God, nonetheless arose in a fury at these tidings, declaring that only the Kingsmoot could make a king. Thus the captains and the kings assembled once more on Old Wyk, and Eric the Ugly was unmade in an instant, and condemned to death, a fate he avoided by breaking his father's crown and casting it into the sea as a sign of submission to the Drowned God. In his place the Kingsmoot raised Ragnar Drum, called Ravenfeeder, the Rock King of Old Wyk. By tradition, Driftwood crown itself was broken up and returned to the sea upon the death of its wearer. His successor would don a new crown made from driftwood freshly washed up upon the shore of his home island. Thus, every driftwood crown was different from those that had gone before. Some were small and simple, others huge and unwieldy but magnificent. The centuries that followed were a golden age for the Iron Islands, and a dark age for the first men, as lived beside the sea to the east. Once the reavers had gone forth seeking food to sustain them during winter, wood to build their longships, salt wives to give them sons, and the riches the Iron Islands lacked, but they'd always returned home with their plunder. Under the Driftwood kings, the practice gave way to something far more dangerous: conquest, colonization, and rule. Archways to Harreg's exhaustive history of the Ironborn, at least 111 men who wore a Driftwood crown as High King of the Iron Islands. In fact, if truth be told, the list is admittedly rife with contradictions. Yet none can doubt that the Driftwood kings reached the zenith of their power under Hoare, but he was given as a Greyiron in some accounts, and a Blacktyde in others. He wrote his name in blood in the histories of Westeros, known as the Cruel. He ruled over the Ironborn for 3/4 of a century, living to the ripe old age of 90. By his day, the first men of the Green Land had largely abandoned the shores of the Sunset Sea for fear of the reavers, and the few who remained, chiefly lords in stout castles, paid tribute to the Ironborn. It was this very same king who famously boasted that his writ ran wherever men could smell salt or hear the crash of waves. In his youth, he did what many believed impossible. He captured and sacked Old Town, bringing thousands of women and girls to the Iron Islands in chains. At 30, he defeated the Lords of the Trident in battle, forcing the River King, Bernard II, to bend the knee and yield up his 3 young sons as hostages. 3 years later, he put the boys to death with his own hand, cutting out their hearts when their father's annual tribute was late in coming. When their grieving sire went to war to avenge them, King Hoare and his Iron Men destroyed Bernard's host and had him drowned as a sacrifice to the Drowned God, putting an end to House Justman and throwing the Riverlands into bloody anarchy. But after Hoare, a slow decline began. The kings who followed him played a part in that, yet the men in the Green Lands were likewise growing stronger. The first men were building longships of their own, their towns now defended by stone walls in place of wooden palisades and spiked ditches. The gardeners of Highgarden and the high towers of Old Town were the first to cease paying tribute. When King Theon III Greyjoy sailed against them, he was defeated and slain by Lord Lyman Hightower, the Sea Lion, who revived the practice of thraldom in Old Town just long enough to set the Ironborn captured during the battle to hard labour, strengthening the city's walls. The growing strength of the Westerlands posed even more of an acute threat to the domain of the Driftwood kings. Fair Isle was the first to fall, when its small folk rose up under Gilbert Farman to expel their Ironborn overlords. A generation later, the Lannisters captured the town of Case, where Herrick the Whoreson blew his great gold banded horn, and the town's whores opened the postern gate to his men. 3 successive Ironborn kings attempted to retake the prize and failed, 2 of them dying on the point of Herrick's sword. The ultimate indignity came courtesy of Gerald Lannister, King of the Rock. Gerald the Great, as he is remembered in the West, sailed his own fleet to the Iron Islands in a daring raid, taking hundreds of Ironborn hostage. He kept them in Casterly Rock thereafter, hanging one every time his shores were raided. In the centuries that followed, a succession of weaker kings lost the Arbor, Bear Island, Flint's Fingers, and most of the Ironborn enclaves along the Sunset Sea, until only a handful remained. It must not be thought that the Ironborn won no victories during these years. Battle on the 5th Greyjoy, called Coldwind, destroyed the feeble fleets of the kings of the north. Eric V Harlaw retook Fair Island in his youth, only to lose it again in his old age. His son Harren slew Garth the Grim of Highgarden beneath the walls of Old Town. Half a century later, Joron I Blacktyde captured Giles II Gardener when their fleets clashed off the Misty Island. After torturing him to death, Joron had his corpse cut into pieces so that he might bait his fishhooks with chunks of king. Later in his reign, Joron swept across the Arbor with steel and fire, and supposedly, if legend can be believed, carried off every woman on the island under 30 years of age, thereby earning himself the name Maiden's Bane, by which he is now best remembered. Yet all of these triumphs proved short-lived, along with many of the kings who won them. As the centuries passed, the kingdoms of the Green Lands grew stronger, and the Iron Islands weaker. And late in the Age of Heroes, another crisis weakened and divided the Ironborn further still. Upon the death of King Oregon III Greyiron, Oregon the Bold, his younger sons hurriedly convened a Kingsmoot, while their eldest brother, Torgon, was raiding up the Manda, thinking that one of them would be chosen to wear the Driftwood crown in his place. To their dismay, the captains and kings chose Arathun Goodbrother, a great Wyk instead. The first thing this new king did was command that the sons of the old king be put to death. For that, and for the savage cruelty he often displayed during his 2 years as king, Arathun IV Goodbrother is remembered in the histories as Bad Brother. When Torgon Greyiron returned at last to the Iron Islands, he declared the Kingsmoot to be invalid because he had not been present to push his claim. The priests supported him in this, for they had grown weary of Bad Brother's arrogance and impiety. Small folk and great lords alike rose at their call, rallying to Torgon's banner, until Arathun's own captain hacked him to pieces. Torgon the Latecomer became king in his stead, and ruled for 40 years without ever having been chosen and proclaimed at a Kingsmoot. He proved to be a strong king, just and wise and fair-minded, but he could do little to arrest the declining fortunes of the Iron Islands, for it was during Torgon's reign that most of the Cape of Eagles was lost to the Malisters of Seaguard. Torgon had struck one blow against the institution of the Kingsmoot in his youth, by throwing over the chosen king. In his old age he struck another, calling upon his own son Oregon to help him rule. At court and council, in war and peace, the son remained at his father's side for the best part of 5 years, so when Torgon finally died, it seemed only natural for his chosen heir to succeed him as Oregon IV Greyiron. No Kingsmoot was summoned, and this time, no Gallon Whitestaff arose in wrath to protest the succession. The final and fatal blow against the power of the captains and the kings assembled was dealt when Oregon IV himself died, after a long and undistinguished reign. It had been the dying king's wish that the High Kingship pass to his great-nephew, Arryn Greyjoy, Salt King of Orkmont, known as Arryn Red Hand. The priests of the drowned god were determined not to allow the power of the king-making to be taken from them for a third time. So word went forth that the captains and kings should assemble on Old Wyk for a Kingsmoot. Hundreds came, among them the Salt Kings and Rock Kings of the 7 major islands, and even the Lonely Light. Yet they had scarcely gathered when Arryn Red Hand loosed his axemen on them, and Naga's ribs ran with blood. 13 kings died that day, and 100 priests and prophets. It was an end to the Kingsmoot, and the Red Hand ruled as High King for 22 years thereafter, and his descendants after him. The wandering holy men never again made and unmade kings as they had once done. As the era of the Driftwood crowns and the Kingsmoots faded into memory, House Greyjoy would become the power of the Iron Islands, being known to the pages of history as the Iron Kings. House Greyjoy came from the island of Orkmont and had ruled as Salt Kings and Rock Kings on and off for centuries. They were truly one of the most powerful houses in the Iron Islands. While we cannot be sure, according to some sources, the Greyirons blazoned their arms with the Sea King's head, white with dark green seaweed beard and hair, a black crown on a grey field. While the Greyirons were now the undisputed rulers of the Iron Islands, they were in fact amongst the oldest and most renowned of the great houses of the Isles. During the long age of the Kingsmoot, the captains and kings bestowed the Driftwood crown on no fewer than 38 Greyirons, giving them twice as many High Kings as any other house in the islands. Thus it makes sense why House Greyjoy outgrew the traditions of the Kingsmoot and desired to hold on to power themselves for all of time. Arryn Red Hand's new crown he had won after the slaughter on Old Wyk would not be made of driftwood. Henceforth, the crown of the Iron Islands would be made of black iron and would pass from father to son by right of primogeniture, as was now common among the first men and later the Andals. While there would be some who mourned the loss of this old way, there were just as many who liked the idea of stability, given the turbulent and troubling time the Ironborn were now facing, as the men of the Green Lands learned how to defend from their traditional raiding methods. House Greyjoy were not done with this radical change they had made by ending the Kingsmoot. They would not suffer any other kings on the Isles, no matter how petty and small their claim to this title was. There would be no more Salt Kings, and no more Rock Kings. There would from now on be one single king. Arryn Red Hand and his heirs styled themselves simply King of the Iron Islands. The rulers of Great Wyk, Old Wyk, Pyke, Harlaw, and the Lesser Isles were reduced to lords, and several ancient lines were extinguished entirely when they refused to bend the knee. There are many who point out how this move brought the Ironborn closer in line with the practices of their Westerosi kin to the east, as their own traditional culture and practices started to erode away as the years passed. But as history often shows us, there are always those who seek out power and wish to gain it for themselves. The Game of Thrones, the dangers of politics. Thus, House Greyjoy's grasp upon the Iron Crown did not go uncontested. Along with the Kingsmoot, Gallon Whitestaff's prohibition against the Ironborn making war on one another also perished amidst the slaughter of Old Wyk. Over the centuries that followed, Arryn Red Hand and his successors had to deal with 6 major rebellions and at least 2 major Thrall uprisings. No matter what side of the argument you sit on, it's hard to deny the practices Gallon Whitestaff enforced clearly did have a huge impact in the stability of the Iron Islands. Without them, the Ironborn were no longer one people, aligned with one goal, with one common foe. There were now several individual houses, each looking to gain power. Thus, Ironborn would now do battle with Ironborn. The now lords of the Iron Islands and the lords and kings of the mainland were slow to take advantage of this disunity among the Ironborn. One by one, all the remaining footholds in the Green Lands were lost. The most telling blow was struck by King Garth VII, the Golden Hand, King of the Reach, who drove off the Ironmen from the Misty Islands and renamed them the Shield Islands, and resettled them with his own population, made up of his fiercest warriors and finest sailors, to defend the mouth of the Mander and protect the Reach as a whole. Raiding this land would now be a trying task. Things would only get worse with the coming of the Andals on mainland Westeros. The arrival of the Andals in the Seven Kingdoms only hastened the decline of the Iron Islands more, for unlike the First Men who were gone before, the Andals were fearless sailors, with longships of their own design, as swift and as seaworthy as any the Ironborn could build. As the Andals flooded into the Riverlands, the Westerlands and the Reach, new villages began to spring up along the coasts. Walled towns and stout stone and timber castles rose over every cove and every harbour, and great lords and petty kings alike began to build warships to defend their shores and protect their shipping trade. In due time, the Andals swept over the Iron Islands, just as they had done with the rest of Westeros below the neck. Successive waves of Andal adventurers descended upon the islands, often in allegiance with one faction or another of the Ironborn themselves. Like on the mainland, the Andals intermarried with some of the ancient families of the islands, and brought others to bloody ends with sword and axe. House Greyjoy was among those destroyed. The last Iron King, Ragnar II, was brought down when the Orkments, Drums, Hoares and Greyjoys made a rare common cause against him, supported by a host of Andal pirates, sellswords and warlords. Afterwards, the victors could not agree on who should succeed Ragnar as king of the Iron Islands, so it was decided they would settle a matter by dancing the finger dance, a popular game amongst the Ironborn, wherein players spin a throwing axes at one another and attempt to snatch it from the air. Hoare emerged as the victor at the cost of 2 of his fingers. As Harris Stumphand, he ruled the Iron Islands for 30 years, and with that the Iron Islands saw an end of the Iron Kings of House Greyjoy, but the rise of House Hoare and the Black Blood, who would restore some of the might of the Ironborn, bringing their power and influence across the Seven Kingdoms back to its apex. After all, there is one particular king of House Hoare who would play such a vital role in the Targaryen conquest of the Seven Kingdoms. Many believe the tale of Harras winning his crown by catching an axe to be no more than a singer's tale. In truth, Archmaester Harag suggests that Harras was chosen because he had taken an Andal maiden for his wife, thereby winning the support of her father and many other Andal lords in the mainland, which facilitated the growth of the Ironborn across the Riverlands. With the age of the Iron Kings left to the pages of history, the next era of the Iron Islands would be led by the Kings of House Hoare. Archmaester Pyke of the Citadel tells us that the Kings of House Hoare were black of hair, black of eye, black of heart. Their foes claimed their blood was black as well, darkened by the Andal taint. For many of the early Hoare kings took maidens of that ilk to wife. True Ironborn had salt and water in their veins, the priests of the drowned gods proclaimed. The black-blooded Hoares were false kings, ungodly usurpers who must be cast down. Many tried to do just that over the centuries, as the Archmaester relates in some detail. None, however, succeeded. What the Hoares lacked in valour, they made up for in cunning and cruelty. Few of their subjects ever loved them, but many had good reason to fear their wrath. Their very names proclaimed their natures to us. Even after the passages of hundreds of years, Wulfgar the Widowmaker, Hogar the Priest-Killer, Fragon the Fierce, Oathgar the Soulless, Othgar the Demon-Lover, Craghorn of the Red Smile, the priests of the drowned gods denounced them all. It must be fair we consider, were the kings of House Hoare truly as ungodly as the holy men proclaimed? Archmaester Pyke believed there were. Archmaester Harag takes a very different view on the matter, suggesting that the true crime of the black-blooded kings was neither impiety nor demon worship, rather tolerance. For it was under the Hoares that the faith of the Seven and the Andals came to the Iron Islands for the first time. Prompted by their Andal queens, the kings granted scepters and septons their protection, and gave them leave to move about the islands preaching the faith of the Seven. The first sept on the Iron Islands was built on Great Wyk during the reign of Wulfgar Widowmaker, when his great-grandson Hogar permitted the building of another on Old Wyk, where the Kingsmoot had been held in centuries of old. The entire island rose up in bloody rebellion, goaded by the priests of the drowned god. The sept was burned, the septons pulled to pieces, the worshippers dragged into the sea to drown, that they might regain their faith. It was in answer to this, Harrig alleges that Hoare also discouraged the practice of reaving, and as reaving declined, trade began to grow. There was still wealth on the Iron Islands in the form of iron ore, found beneath the hills of Great Wyk, Orkmont, Harlaw and Pyke, and lead and tin in some places as well. The Ironmen's need for wood to build their ships remained as important as ever, but they no longer had the strength to take it wherever they found it. Instead, they traded iron for timber, and when winter came and the cold winds blew, iron ore became the coin the kings of House Hoare used to buy barley, wheat and turnips to keep their small folk fed, and beef and pork for their own tables. Paying the iron price took on a whole new meaning, one many Ironborn found humiliating, and the priests declared shameful. The depth of Ironborn pride and power was reached during the reigns of the three Harmons. On the Isles, they are best remembered as Harren the Host, Harren the Haggler, and Harren the Handsome. Harren the Host was the first king of the Iron Islands, known to be literate. He welcomed travellers and traders from far corners of the world to his castle on Great Wyk. He treasured books and gave septons and sceptres his protection. His son, Harren the Haggler, shared his love of reading and became renowned as a great traveller. He was the first king of the Iron Islands to visit the Green Lands without a sword in his hands. Having spent his youth as a ward of House Lannister, the second Harmond returned to Casterly Rock as king and took the Lady Lea Lannister, a daughter of the King of the Rock, and the fairest flower in the west for his queen. On a later voyage he visited Highgarden and Oldtown to treat with their lords and kings and foster trade. His own sons were raised in the faith, King Harmon's own particular version of it at least. Upon his death, the eldest of his sons ascended the throne, Harren the Handsome. Influenced, some say, by his Lannister mother, the Dowager Queen Lea, he announced that henceforth reavers would be hanged as pirates rather than celebrated, and he also formally outlawed the taking of salt wives, declaring the children of such unions to be bastards with no rights of inheritance. He was considering a measure to end the practice of thraldom on the islands as well, when a priest known as Shrike began to preach against him. Other priests took up the cry, and the lords of the Isles took heed. Only the Septons and their followers stood by King Harren, as he was overthrown within a fortnight, almost bloodlessly. What followed was far from bloodless, however. The Shrike himself tore out the deposed king's tongue, so he might never speak lies and blasphemies. Harren was blinded as well, and his nose was cut off, so all men might see him for the monster he is. In place, the lords and priests crowned his younger brother Hagon. The new king quickly denounced the faith, rescinded Harren's edicts, and expelled the septons and sceptres from his realm. Within a fortnight, every sept in the Iron Islands was aflame. King Hagon, soon to be known as Hagon the Heartless, even permitted the mutilation of his own mother, Queen Lea, the Lannister Hoare, who was blamed by Shrike for turning her husband and sons away from their true god, the drowned god. Her lips, ears and eyelids were cut off, and her tongue ripped out with hot pincers, after which she was bundled onto a longship and returned to Lannisport. The King of the Rock, her nephew, was so angered by this atrocity that he called his banners. The war that followed left 10,000 dead, 3/4 of them Ironborn. In the 7th year, the Westermen landed on Great Wyk, smashed Hagon's host in battle, and captured his castle. Hagon the Heartless was mutilated in the same fashion as his mother before being hanged. So Aubrey Crackle, commanding the Lannister armies, ordered the Hoare castle to be razed to the ground. But as his men were looting, they came upon Harren the Handsome in the dungeons. Crackle briefly considered restoring Harren to his throne, Archmaester Harrig claims. But the former king was blind, broken, and half mad from long confinement, so Aubrey granted him the gift of death instead, serving Harren a cup of wine laced with milk of the poppy. Then, in an act of mad folly, the knight decided to claim the kingship of the Iron Islands for himself. This pleased neither the Ironborn nor the Lannisters. When word reached Casterly Rock, the king called his warships home, leaving Crackle to fend for himself. Without the power and wealth of House Lannister to prop him up, King Aubrey saw his power crumble quickly. His reign lasted less than half a year before he was captured and sacrificed to the sea by the Shrike himself. The war between the Ironborn and the Westermen continued in an unorderly fashion for 5 more years, finally ending in an exhausted peace that left the Iron Islands impoverished, burned and broken. The winter that followed was long and harsh, and is remembered on the Isles as the Famine Winter. Pyke tells us that 3 times as many Ironborn perished of starvation that winter that had died in the pointless and bloody battles that preceded it. After the downfall of the kings of House Hoare, it would be centuries before the Iron Islands recovered. A long, slow climb back up to prosperity and power. Of the kings who reigned during this bleak and terrible age, we need not mention. Many were puppets of lords and priests. A few were more like the reavers of the Age of Heroes, men such as Hoare and his son Ravos the Reaper, who savaged the north in the years of the Hungry Wolf's bloody reign, but they were rare and far between. Both reaving and trade played a part in the restoration of the pride and prowess of the islands. Other kingdoms now built larger and more formidable warships than the Iron Men, but nowhere were sailors any more daring. Merchants and traders sailing from Lannisport and the harbours of Great Wyk, Harlaw and Orkmont spread out across the seas, calling at Lannisport, Old Town and the free cities, and returning with treasures their forebears had never dreamed of. Reaving continued as well, but the wolves of the sea of old no longer hunted close to home. The Greenland kings had grown too powerful to provoke. Instead, they found their prey in more distant seas, in the Basilisk Isles and the Stepstones, and along the shores of the disputed lands. Some took service as sail cells, fighting for one or another of the free cities in their endless trade wars. One such was Harwin Hoare, third-born son of King Harwyn the Cunning, a shrewd and advantageous king. Harwyn had spent his entire reign accumulating wealth and avoiding war. War is bad for trade, he said infamously, even as he was doubling, then tripling the size of his fleets and commanding his smiths to forge more armour, swords and axes. Weakness invites attack, Harwyn declared. To have peace we must be strong. His son Harwyn had no use for peace, but much and more for arms and armour that his father had forged. A belligerent boy, by all accounts, and third in the line of succession, Harwin Hoare was sent to sea at an early age. He sailed with a succession of reavers in the Stepstones, visited Volantis, Tyrosh and Bravos, and became a man in the pleasure gardens of Lys. Spent 2 years in the Basilisk Isles as a captive of a pirate king, sold his sword to a free company in the disputed lands, and fought in several battles as a second son. When Harwin returned to the Iron Islands, he found his father, Harwyn, dying, and his eldest brother 2 years dead from grayscale. A second brother stood between Harwyn and the crown, and his sudden death, even as the king was breathing his last breath, remains a matter of dispute to this day. Those present at Prince Harlan's passing declared his death an accident, the result of a fall from a horse. But of course, it would have been worth their lives to suggest otherwise. Beyond the Iron Islands, it was widely assumed that Prince Harwyn was behind his brother's demise. Some claimed he had done the deed himself, others that Prince Harlan had been slain by a faceless man of Bravos. King Harwyn expired 6 days after the crown prince, leaving his third-born son to inherit the throne. As Harwyn Hardhand, he would soon write his name in blood across the histories of the Seven Kingdoms. When the new king visited his father's shipyards, he declared that longships are meant to be sailed. When he inspected the royal armories, he announced that the swords are meant to be bloodied. King Harwyn had often said that weakness invites attack. When his son gazed across Iron Man's Bay, he saw only weakness and confusion in the Riverlands, where the Lords of the Tridents chafed relentlessly beneath the heel of the Storm King, Arak Durradan, in the far-off distant Stormlands. Harwyn assembled a host and led it across the bay on 100 of his father's longships, landing unchallenged north of Seaguard. They carried their ships overland to the Blue Fork of the Trident, and then swept downstream with fire and sword. A few of the river lords took up arms against them, but most did not, for they had little love and less loyalty to the liege lord in the Stormlands. In those days, the Ironborn were thought to be savage fighters at sea, but easily put to rout on land. But Harwyn Hoare was not like other Ironborn. tempered in the disputed lands, he proved to be as fierce afoot as he was at sea, routing every foe. After he dealt the Blackwoods a crushing defeat, many lords of the Trident declared for him. At Fairmarket, Harwynd found himself facing Arek Durridon, the young Storm King, leading a host half again the size of his own. But the Stormlanders were ill-led, weary, and far from home, and the Ironmen and Riverlords shattered them. King Arek lost 2 brothers and half his men, and was lucky to escape with his own life. As he fled south, the small folk of the Riverlands rose up, and his garrisons were driven out or slaughtered. The broad, fertile Riverlands and their wealth passed from the hands of the Storm Kings to those of the Ironborn. In one bold stroke, Harwyn Hardhand had increased his holdings tenfold, and made the Iron Islands once more a power to be feared. Those lords of the Trident who had joined him in hopes of freeing themselves from the Durandons soon learned that the new master was far more brutal and demanding than their old one. Harwyn would rule his conquest with a heavy hand until his death, spending far more time in the Riverlands than on the Iron Islands, riding from one end of the Trident to the other at the head of a rapturous army, sniffing out any hint of rebellion, whilst collecting taxes, tributes, and salt wives. His place was a tent, his throne a saddle, men said of him. His son Halleck, who succeeded to the crown when the Hard Hand died in his 64th year, was a man of the same ilk. Halleck visited the Iron Islands only 3 times during his reign, spending less than 2 years there all told. Though he called himself Ironborn, sacrificed to the drowned gods, and always kept 3 priests at his side, there was more of the Trident than of the salt sea in Halleck Hoare, and he seemed to look upon the islands only as a source of arms, ships, and men. His own reign was even more bloodier than his father's, if less successful, marked by unsuccessful wars against the Westermen and Stormlanders, and no less than 3 failed attempts to conquer the Vale, all ending in disaster at the Bloody Gate. Like his sire, King Halleck spent a great deal of his reign in camp tents on campaign. When not at war, he ruled his broad domain from a modest tower house at Fairmarket in the heart of the Riverlands, near the site of his father's greatest victory. His own son, when he became king, desired a grander seat than that, and would spend most of his own reign building it. But the tale of Harren the Black and the building of Harrenhal is one for another time. While the work of kings such as Harwyn Hoare cannot be understated, when the name Hoare is mentioned, there is one king, one man, who comes to the forefront even hundreds of years later. So deep is his infamy. We are of course talking about Harren the Black, the last king of House Hoare, and the last king of the Isles and Rivers. Sadly, history does not document much of his early life, but what we do know is Harren was the grandson of King Harwyn Hardhand, who extended the Ironborn rule over the Riverlands from the Neck to the Blackwater Rush. Harren had an unnamed brother, who by the time of Aegon's conquest had become the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Why and when his brother joined the Watch is not known, but it is likely doing so allowed him to avoid the fiery fate of his kin. Harren's reign, from what we know of it, was a bloody one. Even in comparison to the centuries of Ironborn kings before him, he was said to be a vain, bloody tyrant hated by all those he ruled, not just in the Riverlands, but in the Iron Islands as well, as like his father and grandfather, Harren spent much more time in the Greenlands than on the Isles or even at sea. While his grandfather and father had ruled their large kingdom from a modest tower house in the town of Fairmarket, Harren dreamed of something far grander for his seat, a castle of the like that had never been seen in Westeros before, and has never been attempted since. Construction of this grand castle of Harrenhal took nearly 40 years to complete. The Riverlands, the Iron Islands, and lands further beyond were drained of their resources and wealth to finance the building of the monstrous castle on the shores of the God's Eye. While historians don't go as far as calling it slave labour, Harrenhal was raised by men mostly made captive by Harren, with thousands said to have died in the quarries, chained to sledges, or labouring on the towering walls and 5 huge towers that make up the castle. For many, he committed a sacrilegious act, cutting down the better part of a godswood to use the weirwood for rafters and beams. Harrenhal was designed to be immensely strong, with the tallest curtain wall and towers ever seen in Westeros. The walls were not only tall, but incredibly thick, and its rooms are built on a scale that would be more comfortable for giants. Harrenhal hosts the largest chamber in Westeros, called the Hall of 1,000 Halves, even larger than the throne room of the Red Keep. The castle was chosen as the location of the Great Council of 101 AC because it was not known how many lords would attend, and space was needed for at least 500 lords and their entourages. In total, more than 1,000 came. The castle covers 3 times as much ground as Winterfell, and its buildings are so much larger that they can scarcely be compared. Its stables can house up to 1,000 horses. Its godswood covers 20 acres, and its kitchens are as large as the Great Hall of Winterfell. Even before construction was finished, Harrenhal was a sight to behold, akin to the likes of the Wall in the north, or the High Tower in the south. Harrenhal was built on this gigantic scale, with its colossal curtain walls sheer and high as a mountain cliff, while atop the battlements, the wood and iron scorpions seemed as small as their namesakes when seen from the gates below. The gatehouse itself was as large as Winterfell's Great Keep. In the year 2 BC, Harren finally completed his grand castle, in many places with the finishing touches finally being added. But in principle, Harrenhal, after 40 long years, an unthinkable amount of resources and gold, and countless lives lost, was completed. But it did not last long, as Harren's dream would turn to ash. Aegon Targaryen, Lord of Dragonstone, landed in Westeros to the south of Harrenhal, on the site that would become King's Landing. After taking some time to consolidate his position, he sent Visenya Targaryen with her dragon Vhagar to the Vale, Rhaenys Targaryen, her dragon Meraxes, and Orys Baratheon to the Stormlands to deal with the Storm Kings of House Durrandon, and Aegon himself moved for the Riverlands, and thus began the conquest. Harren's men harassed Aegon's line of march as they approached the God's Eye in the Battle of the Reeds, with Aegon easily pushing back Harren's men. But later at the Battle of the Wailing Willows, 2 of Harren's sons were victorious, for a time at least. While they were returning to Harrenhal across the God's Eye, the sons were killed by Aegon's monstrous dragon, Balerion the Black. The issue Harren faced was his decades of tyrannical rule over the Riverlands had earned him little love from his lords. In fact, some were all too keen to rally to Aegon's banner. As Aegon advanced towards Harrenhal, many of the River Lords, led in principle by Lord Edmund Tully, revolted against Harren to support the Targaryen invader and join the conquest host. Harren took refuge in his well-stocked Harrenhal. Harren could sit behind his huge walls for months, maybe even years, waiting for reinforcement from the Iron Islands, or at least that is what he believed. Aegon was of a different mind, however. Once he had joined his power with that of Edmund Tully and the other Riverlords to ring in the castle, Aegon and a maester approached the gates of Harrenhal under a peace banner at a parley. Harren emerged to meet him, an old man and grey, yet still fierce in his black armour. Each king had a banner bearer and his maester in attendance, so the words that were exchanged are still remembered. "Yield now," Aegon began, "and you may remain as Lord of the Iron Islands. Yield now, and your sons will live to rule after you. I have 8,000 men outside your walls. What is outside my walls is of no concern to me," said Harren. "Those walls are strong and thick, but not so high as to keep out a dragon," Aegon said. "Dragons fly. I built in stone," Harren replied. "Stone does not burn." To which Aegon said, "When the sun sets, your line shall end." It is said that Harren spat at that and returned to his castle. Once inside, he sent every man of his to the parapets, armed with spears and bows, promising lands and riches to whichever one of them could bring down Balerion the Black. "Had I a daughter, the Dragon Slayer could claim her," Harren proclaimed. "Instead, I will give him one of Tully's daughters, or all 3 if he likes, or maybe pick one of Blackwood's whelps, or Strong's, or any girl born of these traitors of the Trident, these lords of yellow mud." Then Harren retired to his tower, surrounded by his household guard, to sup with his remaining sons. As the last light of the sun faded, Harren's men stared into the gathering darkness, clutching their spears and crossbows. When no dragon appeared, some may have thought that Aegon's threats had been hollow, but Aegon Targaryen took Balerion up high, through the clouds, up and up, until the dragon was no bigger than a fly upon the moon. Only then did he descend, well inside the castle walls. On wings as black as pitch, Balerion plunged through the night, and when the great towers of Harrenhal appeared beneath him, the dragon roared his fury, and bathed them in black fire, shot through with swirls of red. Stone does not burn, Harren had boasted, but his castle was not made of stone alone. Wood and wool and hemp and straw, bread and salted beef and grain, it all took fire. Nor were Harren's iron men made of stone. Smoking, screaming, shrouded in flame, they ran across the yard and tumbled from the walkways to die upon the ground below. And every stone will crack and melt if fire is hot enough. The riverlords outside the castle walls said later that the towers of Harrenhal glowed red against the night like 5 great candles, and like candles they began to twist and melt as runnels of molten stone ran down the sides. Harren and his last sons died in the fires that engulfed his monstrous fortress that night. House Hoare effectively died with him, and so too did the Iron Islands hold on the Riverlands. The next day, outside the smoking ruins of Harrenhal, King Aegon accepted an oath of fealty from Edmund Tully, the Lord of Riverrun, and named him Lord Paramount of the Trident. The other Riverlords did him homage as well, to Aegon as king, and Edmund Tully as their new liege lord. When the ashes had cooled enough to allow men to enter the castle safely, the swords of the fallen, many now shattered or melted, or twisted into ribbons of steel by dragonfire, were gathered up and sent back to the Aegon fort in wagons. And with that ended House Hoare, and the last of the kings of the Isles and Rivers. But the downfall of one house sees the rise of another, and now was the time, once more, for House Greyjoy to rise. The dreams of crowns had seemed to haunt House Greyjoy throughout its long history. Often as not, it ends in defeat, despair and death, as it did for Balon Greyjoy. The writings of Maester Yandel, The World of Ice and Fire. With the downfall of Harren the Black during Aegon's conquest, House Greyjoy would rise up and fill the power vacuum left behind by House Hoare, who had been kings of the Isles and Rivers for generations. In ancient times, like most of the houses of the Iron Islands, the Greyjoys of Pyke claimed descent from the Grey Kings of the Age of Heroes. During the era of the Driftwood Kings, Salt Kings and Rock Kings, the Greyjoys, while a large and powerful house, did not boast as many kings as their neighbours in House Greyiron and Goodbrother. We do not know exactly how many Greyjoy kings ruled the Iron Islands, as much of their history of this time was not recorded, but there are 3 named Greyjoy kings who were crowned High King of the Iron Islands: Loror, Theon III, and Balon V. Given this, it is likely there were many more Greyjoy kings during this era. The Iron Lords, including the Greyjoys, intermarried with the victorious Andals when they invaded the Iron Islands, and they also allied with Andals against the Greyiron kings. But House Greyjoy would become the undisputed power of the Iron Islands in the wake of Aegon's conquest. At the time of Aegon's conquest, King Harren the Black of House Hoare ruled all the lands between the mountains from the Neck to the Blackwater Rush, when Harren and his sons perished in the burning of Harrenhal by King Aegon I Targaryen. He granted the Riverlands to Lord Edmund Tully of Riverrun, one of the first Riverlords to turn on Harren and join the conquest. The surviving lords of the Iron Islands who were not at Harrenhal, as one might expect, given what we know of the Ironborn, fell into chaotic squabbling, leading Aegon to invade the islands to subdue them. After they bent the knee, Aegon allowed them to revive their ancient custom of the Kingsmoot and choose who should have the lordship of the islands from those amongst them. They chose Lord Wyk Greyjoy of Pyke. Since Wykon's election at the end of the conquest, the Greyjoys have ruled the Iron Islands as the Lord Reapers of Pyke. As King Aegon now followed the faith of the Seven and had been anointed by the High Septon at Oldtown, Wyk reluctantly allowed the Septons and Scepters of the Faith to return to the Iron Islands after their brutal expulsion centuries before, once again angering many of the priests of the Drowned God and many of his more pious lords, an issue that still persists on the Isles today. Wykon's son, Goran, who succeeded his father in 33 AC, defeated a rebel claiming to be the priest king, Lodos the Twice Drowned, in 37 AC. As a reward, King Aenys I Targaryen, the eldest son of the Conqueror, granted Goran any boon within his power to give. Goran requested permission to expel the Septons and Septors in the Iron Islands, which Aenys was forced to allow. This would go on to sour Aenys' own relations with the faith further and contributed to the faith uprising that ultimately led to his downfall. House Greyjoy and the Ironborn would very much keep to themselves for the better part of a century, until 129 AC and the outbreak of the Targaryen Civil War, known as the Dance of the Dragons, fought between King Aegon II and Queen Rhaenyra. The women of the West prefer men of iron to cowardly lions, it would seem, for they jump into the sea and plead with us to take them. Dalton Greyjoy to Tyler Lannister, Fire and Blood, under the Regents, the Hooded Hand. During the dance, Lord Dalton Greyjoy, known in the history books as the Red Kraken, was offered the office of Master of Ships and a place on the small council of King Aegon II Targaryen in exchange for an alliance. Preferring Rhaenyra Targaryen's offer over Aegon's, Dalton sided with the Black faction instead. He raided along the western coast of Westeros during the remainder of the war, pillaging much wealth and even bringing back captives to the Isles, despite this being outlawed by King Jaehaerys I Targaryen. Following war's end, and into the regency of King Aegon III, Dalton was commanded to cease his raiding by the Regency Council and Lord Protector of the Realm, Unwin Pyke, but he ignored them, seeing the authority of House Targaryen as weak. King Aegon III's regents eventually sent Lord Alan Velaryon to the Westerlands to deal with Dalton. Before Alan could sail around Westeros to deal with the Red Kraken, however, Dalton was murdered at Faircastle by a woman named Tess. He would be succeeded by his eldest salt son, Lord Torrhen Greyjoy, amidst a struggle for power among the Ironborn that was resolved fairly quickly. Much like before the dance, House Greyjoy would stabilise the Iron Islands for the rest of the Targaryen era of Westeros. During this time, a Lord Alton Greyjoy sought new lands to conquer beyond the Lonely Light, failing much like every other attempt to do so. A Lord Dagon Greyjoy raided the coastal areas of the Seven Kingdoms, sacking the town of Little Dosk during the reign of King Aerys I Targaryen. A Lord Beron Stark gathered swords, and House Lannister built ships in an effort to drive Lord Dagon and his Iron Men back to the Iron Islands. Dagon was ultimately unable to resist the might of House Targaryen. The Iron Islands supported the Iron Throne during the War of the Ninepenny Kings against the Band of Nine and Maelys Blackfyre, with Lord Quillian Greyjoy leading 100 longships to fight in the Stepstones. During his time as Lord, Quillian outlawed thraldom and wanted to integrate the Iron Islands into the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. Thus, he pursued neutrality during Robert's Rebellion in an attempt to do this. But encouraged by his sons, however, Quillian joined the rebels after Prince Rhaegar Targaryen's death at the Battle of the Trident. But by this time, in reality, most of the war was very much over. To much surprise, the Lord of the Iron Islands was killed in battle at the Manda in the Reach. Quillian was succeeded by his eldest surviving son, Lord Balon Greyjoy, who rejected his father's works and ideas of closer relations with the rest of Westeros and wanted to return to the old way of paying the iron price, reaving and pillaging. Balon spent 5 years building an iron fleet, believing that the new king Robert Baratheon and his reign was weak and only held up by the gold and reputation of Tywin Lannister. "You may take my head, but you cannot name me traitor. No Greyjoy ever swore an oath to a Baratheon," Balon said. "Swear one now, or lose that stubborn head of yours," replied Robert Baratheon. An exchange between King Robert Baratheon and Lord Balon Greyjoy from the World of Ice and Fire. In 289 AC, Balon declared himself King of the Iron Islands, the first Iron King for near on 300 years. In a bid for independence from the Iron Throne, the Greyjoy Rebellion had some early victories before the rest of the Seven Kingdoms were prepared for a war, destroying the Lannister fleet at anchor at Lannisport and raiding the western coast, almost uncontested. But Balon had misjudged Robert's position. The mainland rallied their support for Robert, and the Iron Islands were invaded by the king, his brother Lord Stannis, Lord Eddard Stark, Lord Tywin Lannister, and Sir Barristan Selmy. Balon lost his 2 eldest sons in the war, and although Robert pardoned the would-be king in return for bending the knee, Balon's surviving son Theon was sent to Winterfell to be a ward and hostage of Lord Eddard Stark, leaving him only his daughter Asha in his care. Balon Greyjoy would remain peaceful for the rest of Robert's reign. It was only with the outbreak of the War of the Five Kings in the wake of Robert Baratheon's death and the execution of Eddard Stark did Balon once again call himself king. House Greyjoy have always been a major house in the Iron Islands, and they were rightly king several times before. But that is what makes the Iron Islands so different from the mainland Westeros. How quickly kings rise and fall, how fleeting kingship for each house was. As of now, House Greyjoy is the power in the Iron Islands, but as history shows us, their fall could happen at even the most unexpected time. Harlaw was not the largest of the Iron Islands, but it was the richest and most populous, and Lord Roderick's power was not to be despised. The Thoughts of Asha Greyjoy, A Feast for Crows, Chapter 11, The Kraken's Daughter. House Harlaw of Harlaw is one of the most powerful houses from the Iron Islands, and as of Aegon's conquest, they have been sworn to House Greyjoy of Pyke, who rule over all of the Iron Islands. From their castle of 10 Towers, House Harlaw have dominion over the entire island of Harlaw, the richest and most populous of the Isles. The island of Harlaw itself is the easternmost of the archipelago that make up the Iron Islands. Located northeast of Pyke, from which it is a day's sail, and southeast of Orkmont and Blacktyde. Banefort in the Westlands is across Iron Man's Bay to the south. The current seat is the Castle of 10 Towers, with their arms being a silver scythe on black. All the other houses on Harlaw pledge fealty to House Harlaw, including House Kenning, Mere, Stonetree and Bolmark. They also have several cadet branches, with a total of 4 known, located at Greygarden, Harlaw Hall, Harraden Hill, and the Tower of the Glimmering. Like most of the houses of the Iron Islands, the Harlaws claim descent from the Grey Kings of legend. During the Age of Heroes, many men of House Harlaw were both Rock Kings and Salt Kings at various points. As time progressed, the Kings of the Ironborn submitted to the idea of a High King. Several men of House Harlaw were elected for the role via Kingsmoot. Some of these Harlaw High Kings would paint their name in the history books, such as the young Eric V Harlaw, who recovered Fair Isle for the Ironborn, but he eventually lost the island once he grew old. His son Harren Harlaw slew Garth II Gardener, the King of the Reach, beneath the walls of Old Town. However, the institution of the Kingsmoot was put to an end by King Aron Greyiron, and the Harlaws were reduced to lords ever since. After the fiery end of the last king of the Isles and Rivers, Harren Hoare, during Aegon's conquest, House Harlaw became sworn to Aegon's chosen lord of the Isles, House Greyjoy of Pyke. During the reign of King Aegon I, Queen Rhaenys Targaryen, who had made it her goal to make matches up and down Westeros between houses that were otherwise strangers, arranged a betrothal between a Harlaw and one of the triplet daughters born to the Even Star of Tarth. After the death of Lord Dalton Greyjoy, known as the Red Kraken in 134 AC, the Harlaws and Blacktydes joined Dalton's cousin in raising up Roderick Greyjoy, the youngest salt son of Dalton, as the new lord of the Iron Islands. Amidst the violent conflict over succession, Lady Joanna Lannister launched an invasion of the Iron Islands, landing Lannister swords and spears on Harlaw. Lords of Harlaw were among the lords put to the sword by the invading Westermen. The Harlaw seat was Harlaw Hall until the reign of Lord Theomore Harlaw. Theomore had lost 3 newborn sons due to the dampness and unhealthiness of Harlaw Hall and decided to build a better suited castle, a much more comfortable seat. Since Theomore was a changeable man, he built 10 different keeps, which were eventually all connected by walkways and covered bridges, creating the castle that's now known as 10 Towers. The Hall of 10 Towers contains the high seat of House Harlaw, with 2 giant scythes of beaten silver hanging crossed above the seat. The Book Tower, the fattest of the castle towers, is octagonal and made of large black stones. The Widow's Tower is called so due to the presence of Lord Roderick's sister, Lady Gwyneth Harlaw. A small village lies near 10 Towers, and it's said there's good fishing off Longstone Quay. Of the 4 cadet branches of the house, the whys and hows of how they were formed is not entirely clear. House Harlaw of Greygarden rule from their seat of Greygarden. While the exact location of their seat is not known, Sir Harris Harlaw, the Knight of Greygarden, is the cousin and current designated heir of Lord Roderick Harlaw. His personal banner is the Harlaw scythe quartered with the peacock of his mother's house, House Seret. He also bears a Valyrian steel sword called Nightfall. House Harlaw of Harlaw Hall is led by Sigfrid Harlaw, who is the current head of the house. Harlaw Hall was the original seat of House Harlaw, Harlaw's main branch, but after it was abandoned after the construction of 10 Towers, despite its state of disrepair, it was given to the current Harlaw Hall cadet branch. House Harlaw of Harraden Hill has their seat located on a hill near Harlaw Hall. The current head of the house is Bormund Harlaw. The final cadet branch is House Harlaw of the Tower of Glimmering, with Hotho Harlaw currently the head of the house. In more recent history, after the downfall of House Targaryen and the rise of House Baratheon as kings of Westeros, very little changed in terms of House Harlaw for the most part. After the death of their father, Roderick Harlaw became Lord of Harlaw instead of his sister Gwenese, who is 7 years his elder. Roderick's other sister, Alanis, wed Lord Balon Greyjoy, the Lord Reaper of Pyke, with the pair going on to have 3 sons and a daughter. The eldest, Roderick Greyjoy, was named after his uncle. When Balon Greyjoy decided to rise up against King Robert Baratheon in 289 AC and name himself king, Lord Roderick had unsuccessfully attempted to dissuade him from what he saw as a foolish and hopeless endeavour. In the resulting Greyjoy Rebellion, Roderick's 2 sons died in sea battles off Fair Isle, as did Gwenese Harlaw's husband. The Iron Throne proceeded to land ships on the islands, and Harlaw was among the islands that saw battle. "I need you to raise the men of Harlaw," Asher said. "The men of Harlaw are here, the ones who count." Some were shouting Euron's name. "I will not set Harlaw against Harlaw." A Dance with Dragons, Chapter 29, The Wayward Bride. By the time of the War of the Five Kings in 298 AC, Alanis Harlaw now resides permanently at 10 Towers, and not with her husband Lord Balon Greyjoy on Pyke. Alanis is very mentally frail after the deaths of her 2 sons during the Greyjoy Rebellion, and Theon Greyjoy being taken as a hostage. After Theon Greyjoy returns to the Iron Islands as an envoy for Robb Stark, when his father Balon calls his banners, the silver scythe of House Harlaw is seen by Theon. When Theon is later sent to raid the Stony Shore to prove himself Ironborn by his father, 4 men of House Harlaw join Theon. They stick with him during the capture of Winterfell and were likely killed when the castle was sacked by House Bolton. After the death of Balon Greyjoy and the seizure of the Seastone Chair at Pyke by Euron Greyjoy, his brother, Lord Roderick summons Lords of the Iron Islands to 10 Towers on behalf of his niece, Asher Greyjoy, who they view as the rightful ruler of the Iron Islands. Hotho brings Roderick a copy of Archmaester Marwyn's The Book of Lost Books from Old Town, trying to gain his favour, since Hotho hopes to marry his daughter to Roderick. Lord Roderick offers to make Asher the heir to 10 Towers, although Sir Harris Harlaw would still become the head of the house. She rejects this offer, choosing to seek the Driftwood crown instead. Lord Harlaw's longship, Seasong, is seen on the shores of Old Wyk, and Aeron Greyjoy spots the Harlaw scythe among the many gathered banners for the Kingsmoot. When speaking to Asher before the Kingsmoot, Victarion Greyjoy states that Hotho, not Harris, will be Roderick's heir. Roderick offers his full support to his niece Asher during the Kingsmoot, with his designated heir Harris also supporting her as one of her 3 champions. Hotho offers his daughter to Victarion and supports his claim to the Seastone Chair, but he is one of the first to shout Euron Greyjoy's name after he reveals his daring plans, winning the Kingsmoot. Roderick, Harris and Hotho are part of the taking of the Shield Islands as commanded by King Euron. Hotho reports how Harris planted his standard beneath the Grim Castle and defeated them in single combat. After 7 champions had been defeated, Lord Guthor Grim Septon decided the gods had spoken and surrendered the castle. Victarion sees Lord Roderick Harlaw, Gorold Goodbrother and Dustin Drum talking at the yard of Lord Hewitt's castle. The 3 share their fear of a Tyrell reprisal for an attack on the Shield Islands. Harras is named Lord of Greyshield by Euron, a move Victarion Greyjoy interprets as a way to gain his loyalty at Roderick's cost. This also makes Hotho the new heir to 10 Towers. Aeron knew some Farwynds, a queer folk who held some land on the westernmost shore of Great Wyk and the scattered isles beyond, rocks so small that most could support but a single household. Of those, the Lonely Light was the most distant, 8 days sail to the northwest, amongst rookeries of seals and sea lions and the boundless grey oceans. The Farwynds there were even queerer than the rest. Some said they were skin changers, unholy creatures who could take on the forms of sea lions, walruses, even spotted whales. The wolves of the wild sea, the thoughts of Aeron Greyjoy. A Feast for Crows, Chapter 19, The Drowned Man. House Farwynd of the Lonely Light is a branch of House Farwynd from the Iron Islands, and by far one of the most unique houses in not just the Iron Islands, but Westeros as a whole. Their seat is the Lonely Light, a small group of 13 tiny islands, approximately 8 days' sail to the northwest of Great Wyk, depending on the season, weather and tides. Even so, given the unpredictability of sailing that far out into the Sunset Sea, even a simple journey can be perilous for an experienced sailor, even among the Ironborn themselves. The Farwynds blazon their arms with per fessy below a black sea with a crestline and a black longship, outlined against a setting sun on dark red and orange. Another branch of the family, House Farwynd of Sealskin Point, holds lands on the westernmost shore of Great Wyk, including its namesake seat. However, we know very little about this branch of the family, or even which of the branches is the original senior branch, since the builder of the Lonely Light would have had to have sailed from the Iron Islands to find it, causes some speculation that the Sealskin Point branch was the original senior branch. But unlike most cadet houses, this new Lonely Light branch outgrew the original to the extent most assumed the Lonely Light has always been the most senior. However, given how little information we have on this subject, the information may develop and change as we learn more. Their seat of the Lonely Light is perhaps one of the most fascinating, given its nature. It's located technically on the westernmost island of the Iron Islands. However, given the sheer distance from the islands proper, some fairly argue it should be considered its own entity altogether. Regardless of the remoteness of the location, the islands that make up the Lonely Light are considered part of the domain of the Iron Islands, meaning the Farwynds have often sworn themselves to the High Kings of the Isles, and now House Greyjoy since Aegon's conquest. A beacon blazes at almost all times on the roof of the island's namesake keep, which is the seat of House Farwynd. 1,000 years after the time of King Brandon Stark, the Burner, Ironmen sailing out of Great Wyk were blown off course in a generational storm to the cluster of tiny islands 8 days sail from the closest known shore. The captain built a tower and a beacon there, took the name Farwynd, and declared the Lonely Light his seat. If the tales are to be believed as told, it adds more uncertainty to the seniority of this Lonely Light branch of House Farwynd, given it is said the captain took the name Farwynd. While the Lonely Light itself is considered a small island, the other 13 small islands are no bigger than a handful of clusters of rocks around the main island. However, given how west the islands lay into the Sunset Sea, they were for a long time the most western landmass known to man. However, in 56 AC, the famed sailor and explorer Alyssa Farman discovered 3 new islands much further west than the Lonely Light. She named them Aegon, Bisenya, and Rhaenys. And unlike the bleak and inhospitable Lonely Light, these new islands had lush vegetation, freshwater springs, and warm weather, thanks to them being much further south. However, these new islands were so far away from the shipping lanes they held no tactical purpose and thus had never been settled, leaving the Lonely Light as the westernmost settled islands. The Lonely Light is surrounded by rookeries of seals and sea lions, with the people who lived there often using them as a source of food and clothing. The Farwynds themselves, and the few small folk they rule over, and who call these meagre islands their home, are regarded as odd and strange people, even to their Ironborn king. A comparison could be how the men of the Riverlands and the North view the Crannog men of the Neck. Some claim the Farwynds from the Lonely Light lie with seals to bring forth half-human children, while others that they are in fact skin changers, who can take the form of sea lions, walruses, and spotted whales. There are some sources that have also suggested that the Farwynds are worshippers of the Merlings, an aspect of the religion of the drowned god that even the other Ironborn consider too dark to practice. Merling worship is one of the darker religious aspects in the known world, and involves regular blood sacrifice, which is said to give the Farwynds supernatural abilities in return. The Andals and the Faith wiped out all of the other Merling worshippers, but given the remote location, it is possible it survived on the Lonely Light. How much of this is fact is unclear. His eyes, Aeron saw, were now grey, now blue, as changeable as the sea. Mad eyes, he thought, fool's eyes. The vision he spoke of was doubtless a snare set by the Storm God to lure the Ironborn to destruction. The Thoughts of Aeron Greyjoy, A Feast for Crows, Chapter 19, The Drowned Man. The current Lord of the Lonely Light is Gilbert Farwynd. Very little is known about him or his family, but Gilbert is described as tall and spare, with a clean-shaven lantern jaw. Gilbert's eyes appear to change from grey to blue, like the sea, depending on who you ask. House Farwynd first makes a physical appearance during the events of A Feast for Crows in the wake of the War of Five Kings. After the death of Lord Balon Greyjoy, whom was technically the self-proclaimed King of the Isles and North at this time, Lord Gilbert Farwynd is one of the many men to put forth his own name at the Kingsmoot held on Old Wyk for the Ironborn to choose their new king. He was supported by his sons, Giles, Yagon and Johann, who acted as his champions. He promised to lead the Ironborn to lands beyond the Sunset Sea, where every man would be a king and every wife a queen. His gifts are considered poor, his words mad, and his claim is dismissed very quickly, as most of the Ironborn men believe it was impossible to sail any further west into the Sunset Sea and ever return, as all attempts thus far by not just the Ironborn sailors, but sailors around the world, ended in death and ruin. Ultimately, Euron Greyjoy, Balon's younger brother, is elected at the Kingsmoot and dons the Driftwood crown, chosen over the daughter of Balon, Asha Greyjoy. There is only one other member of House Farwynd we have any knowledge of, an unnamed Lord Farwynd, who attended the Great Council of 101 AC to choose the heir of King Jaehaerys I Targaryen prior to the outbreak of the Dance of the Dragons. How this lord voted in the council is not known. Until we get more information, that is all we currently know of House Farwynd. You are the rightful Lord Botley. Once I hold the Seastone chair, your father's lands shall be restored. If you like, it's naught to me. Asha Greyjoy and Christopher Botley, A Feast for Crows, Chapter 11, The Kraken's Daughter. House Botley is one of the noble houses of the Iron Islands and are directly sworn to House Greyjoy of Pyke. Their seat is the town of Lordsport, located on the island of Pyke, on the opposite side of the island as the Greyjoy seat of Pyke. Their blazon is a shoal of silver fish on pale green, and we currently do not know their house words. Given near on all of the houses in the Iron Islands, especially the ancient ones, all claim descent from the Grey King of legend, it is safe to guess that the Botleys, being among the ancient houses, also claim this descent. It also appears that House Botley have never held the title of king during the many eras of the Ironborn. With the records we have access to, no Botley was ever a Rock King, Salt King, Driftwood King, or Iron King. However, it must fairly be recalled that the records we have on this early period of Ironborn history are incomplete. Thus it is still possible, albeit unlikely, they could have been kings once during one of these undocumented times. But if they were, no legends or stories seem to have been passed down within the house about this time. The Botley seat of Lordsport is located near a wooded point with pine-clad bluffs. Contained a small modest castle. Lordsport itself provides safe anchor for those who wish to reach the Castle of Pyke, the seat of House Greyjoy. There is a renowned inn owned by Otter Gimpney, located near the landing. The town is also known for its forges and metalworkers, who produce excellent swords, axes, ringmail, and plate that is desired across the Iron Islands and into the mainland of Westeros. The town also hosts one of the most prominent shipwrights of the Isles. During the reign of House Hoare as kings of the Iron Islands, ships from Lordsport began to trade at Lannisport, Old Town, and as far as the Free Cities in Essos. It is believed that in his youth, a young Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, once sailed to Old Town, Lannisport, and Lordsport as he made his wealth trading, helping set up the events that allowed for the Targaryen Civil War, known as the Dance of the Dragons. In the wake of that civil war, in 134 AC, House Lannister, led by Lady Joanna Lannister, launched an invasion of the Iron Islands during the power struggle that ensued at the murder of Dalton Greyjoy. Dalton and the Ironborn used the Targaryen Civil War to raid the western coast of Westeros and attacked Lannisport directly, carrying off many women and children and burning much of the Lannister fleet. In this bloody Lannister revenge, according to some sources, Lady Joanna donned a man's mail to lead the remaining Lannister host in a struggle to drive the Ironborn from their shores, which would eventually lead them to the Iron Islands themselves. During the Lannister invasion of the islands, the Lord Botley at the time was put to the sword by the Westermen. House Botley and the rest of the Ironborn were punished severely for their part in the attacks on House Lannister. When Roderick Greyjoy was taken and found captive, he was sent to Casterly Rock, as Joanna had him gelded and made her sons fall. When Balon Greyjoy started the Greyjoy Rebellion in 289 AC, House Botley supported their liege lords. During this time, the stronghold of the Botleys had been a great structure of timber and wattle, but when King Robert Baratheon put down the Greyjoys' rebellion, he razed the structure to the ground. A small square stone keep was built afterwards to replace it, with dreams of building something much grander in the future. In the wake of the rebellion, Christopher Botley was sent away to be fostered with Alanis Harlaw, the wife of Lord Balon Greyjoy, as her two eldest sons had been killed in the war, and her only surviving son, Theon, taken hostage by Lord Eddard Stark. When Christopher's more than close relationship with Asher Greyjoy was discovered, he was sent by Lord Balon to Blacktyde. During the events of the War of Five Kings, Theon Greyjoy, who had been a hostage of Eddard Stark since the Greyjoy Rebellion, arrived at Lordsport from Seaguard as an envoy for Robb Stark, the king in the north. He makes note of the new keep of the Botleys, built to replace the one burned down in the rebellion. It was full of pale green flags, emblazoned with the shoal of silvery fish of House Botley, and he remembers that the last time he was in Lordsport, it was a smoking wasteland. In exchange for a horse, Theon takes Wyk Pyke, the bastard son of Sargon Botley, as his squire. When he enters the Great Hall of Pyke, Theon does see some Botleys among his father, Balon Greyjoy's captains. Amaron Botley and his sons are part of Theon's crew on the Sea Bitch when they are sent by Balon to raid the western coast of the mainland, as a way for Theon to prove himself Ironborn. They take part in the Battle of the Stony Shore and quarrel afterwards over plunder. Theon later captures Winterfell with the Botleys as part of the attacking force. Wyk Pyke chooses to stay and fight alongside Theon when Sir Roderick Cassal's army of Northmen approach Winterfell. Two other Botleys join Wyk in staying by Theon. They in all probability are slain by House Bolton during the sack of Winterfell. After the sudden death of Lord Balon Greyjoy, Lord Swain Botley stands against his brother, Euron Greyjoy, as he tries to claim the Seastone chair, with Swain backing Theon Greyjoy as the rightful heir after Balon's death. Euron Crowseye has Swain drowned for that. German Botley pledges fealty to Euron and inherits his brother's lordship instead of his nephew Christopher Botley, and retaining the part of the Botley lands that were not awarded to Lord Walden Winch for his support. Asher Greyjoy later spots the Silverfish of Botley among the banners of those gathered to support her on Harlaw. She is approached by her childhood crush Christopher Botley, the lawful lord of Lordsport, after his father Swain's death. He says his uncle Germund had been named lord by Euron in return for his support, and that half the Botley lands were given over to House Winch, since they were the first to declare for Euron. Christopher proposes marriage to Asher, but she refuses him. Victarion Greyjoy later sees the banners of House Botley and Old Wyk before the Kingsmoot, as does Aeron Greyjoy. During the Kingsmoot itself, Germund wears gilded breastplate he'd taken off a Lannister captain during Balon Greyjoy's rebellion. At the Kingsmoot, Germund shouts for Euron, and Christopher shouts for Asher Greyjoy. Euron would later go on to win the Kingsmoot, becoming king of the Iron Islands, chosen over his niece Asher. Germund later participates in an Ironborn raid on the Shield Islands. He is spotted by Victarion in the hall of Lord Hewitt's castle, with a rope of pearls around his neck. Christopher Botley had filled out since she'd last seen him, but he had the same unruly hair that she remembered, and eyes as large and as trusting as a seal's. Sweet eyes, truly. That was the trouble with poor Christopher. He was too sweet for the Iron Islands. The Thoughts of Asher Greyjoy, A Feast for Crows, Chapter 11. The Kraken's Daughter. After Euron is proclaimed King of the Isles and the North at the Kingsmoot, Christopher sails on his longship to 10 Towers on Harlaw and then Deepwood Motte with 3 other ships of Asha Greyjoys as she contemplates her next move. During this time, he grows a thick brown beard, wears furs, and rides a tall roan stallion. Asha later kisses Christopher after he tells her the tale of Torgon the Latecomer. Yet, Christopher proposes that the Ironborn, under Asha, abandon Westeros and try and make their fortune as traders, which is quickly rejected. When Northern Mountain clansmen approach Deepwood Motte, Asha abandons the castle and leads her Ironborn back towards the Bay of Ice. They are defeated in a fight by Deepwood Motte by Stannis Baratheon's men, however. Despite not being a warrior, Christopher is said to have fought bravely in the battle. While Asha is taken by Stannis for his march on Winterfell, Christopher and the other Ironborn survivors are imprisoned at Deepwood Motte. Asha's 4 longships are captured or burned by Alysanne Mormont. The Ironborn at Deepwood Motte are eventually ransomed from Lady Sybil Glover by Tycho Nestoris. They escort this envoy of the Iron Bank of Braavos to Stannis, whose army is encamped at a crofter's village. As of now, until the publication of the Winds of Winter, that is all we know of House Botley. Balon was mad, Aeron is madder, and Euron is maddest of them all. Baelor Blacktyde to Victorian Greyjoy. A Feast for Crows, Chapter 18, The Iron Captain. Given how small some of the Iron Islands are, the houses that call those islands home often take the name of the island themselves as their own house title. One of these houses is the Blacktydes of the island of Blacktyde in the Iron Islands. The Blacktydes are among the foremost bannermen to House Greyjoy, the Lords of Pyke, since the downfall of the Iron Kings during Aegon's conquest. House Blacktyde blazon their arms with a very green and black. The island they call home is the northernmost of the Iron Islands, and among the smallest. Like most of the ancient houses of the Iron Islands, the Blacktydes claim descent from the Grey King of legend, and thus, over the thousands of years of pre-Targaryen conquest history, have claimed to be both kings and high kings of the Isle. In some historical accounts, Corred the Cruel, the High King of the Iron Islands, is said to have been a Blacktyde. However, he is most often associated with House Hoare, but Corred was said to be one of the greatest High Kings the Isles had ever seen, sacking Oldtown and warring with the kings of the Riverlands. During the reign of King Corred, the Ironborn would rightfully claim that his writ ran wherever men could smell salt water or hear the crash of waves. The Ironborn were at their peak of expansion, ruling territory along the Sunset Sea, from the Arbor to Bear Islands. Many men abandoned the shores for fear of Corred's reavers, while those who remained were forced to pay tribute. But the Kingdom of the Reach called him Corred the Cruel. Corred died at the age of 90, having ruled for 75 years. Corred's conquests were gradually lost by his successors and descendants, however. A High King, King Joran I Blacktyde, captured Giles II Gardener, the King of the Reach, when their fleets clashed off the Misty Island. After torturing the king to death, Joran cut Giles' corpse into pieces for bait for fishing. He also raided the Arbor, carrying off countless women and children. In the wake of the Dance of the Dragons, after the death of Dalton Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands at Faircastle, the Blacktydes and the Harlaws joined the Red Kraken's cousin to raise up Roderick Greyjoy, a younger salt son of Dalton, as the Red Kraken's successor. This resulted in a bloody struggle for power in the Iron Islands that lasted for half a year. During the Baratheon era of Westeros, in the year 289 AC, House Blacktyde, along with the liege lords of House Greyjoy, rebelled against the Iron Throne, with Balon Greyjoy naming himself king. During the ensuing war, Lord Blacktyde was killed in the battle, and after the rebels were defeated, his son Baelor was taken as a hostage for 8 years to the city of Oldtown in the Reach, controlled by House Hightower. Balon the Widowmaker I call him. I will gladly trade his freedom for a father. Have you one to give? Baelor Blacktyde to Victorian Greyjoy. A Feast for Crows, Chapter 18. The Iron Captain. Upon his return to the Iron Islands, Baelor had converted to the mainland's faith of the Seven, much to the horror of some of his Blacktyde and Ironborn kin. Also, after the rebellion, the young Christopher Botley was sent away to be fostered with the Blacktydes. Christopher had originally been fostered at Pyke with the Greyjoys, whom had lost 2 of their sons during the rebellion, with their last living son, Theon Greyjoy, taken as a hostage by Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell. But Christopher was eventually sent away by Lord Balon Greyjoy when Pyke's maester told Balon that Christopher intended to marry Balon's daughter, Asha Greyjoy. During the events of the main book series, when the War of the Five Kings breaks out on mainland Westeros after the death of King Robert I Baratheon, Balon Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands, calls his banners to his seat of Pyke as he once again named himself king. The recently crowned king in the north, Robb Stark, sends his friend Theon Greyjoy to travel to the Iron Islands and seek an alliance with Theon's father, Balon, against the Iron Throne. In the Great Hall of Pyke, Theon later notices his father has gathered hundreds of his captains, with the Blacktydes amongst them. Lord Blacktyde says this Kingsmoot is a dangerous folly. He thinks your uncle would descend on them and kill them all, as Arryn did, Roderick Harlaw to Asha Greyjoy, A Feast for Crows, Chapter 11, The Kraken's Daughter. After Balon Greyjoy apparently falls to his death at Pyke, his younger brother, Aeron Damphair, demands a Kingsmoot be held to elect a new king. Blind Baron Blacktyde is one of the priests of the drowned god who adds their voices to the Damphair's call, wishing to bring back the old way to the Iron Islands that had slowly been eroded during the Targaryen rule of Westeros, and later that of House Baratheon. When visiting Lord Roderick Harlaw at Ten Towers, Lord Baelor Blacktyde fears that Euron Greyjoy, another of the late Lord Balon's brothers, who had already claimed the Seastone chair by this point, would descend upon the other candidates at the Kingsmoot and kill them all, just like Oren Greyiron had done at the last Kingsmoot 1,000 years before. Victarion Greyjoy sees Baelor's ship Nightflyer when he arrives at Naga's Cradle with the Iron Fleet for the Kingsmoot. Remembering that Baelor's father had been killed during the Greyjoy Rebellion, Baelor is cautious about supporting Victarion in the Kingsmoot itself. Baelor later decides to follow Asha Greyjoy instead after she announces that if she were to win, she would bring an end to all the conflicts facing the Iron Islands. Against Aeron's intentions, his hated brother Euron is chosen during the Kingsmoot on Old Wyk. After Euron is crowned, he commands the Iron Fleet to close Naga's Cradle, blocking all of the ships from leaving. Baelor's Nightflyer is seized, and Lord Blacktyde is delivered to Euron in chains for refusing to accept him as king. Euron orders his men to kill Baelor and cuts him into 7 pieces in an ironic tribute to his worship of the 7 mainland gods. And as of the publication of A Dance with Dragons, that is all we currently know of House Blacktyde. The first thing the new king did was command that all the sons of the old king be put to death, and so they were. After that, men called him Bad Brother, though in truth they'd been no kin of his. Christopher Botley, The Asha Greyjoy, A Dance with Dragons, Chapter 26, The Wayward Bride. House Goodbrother stands out as one of the more unique houses of the Iron Islands. Well, culturally, they are similar to the other houses of the Isles, with their history following the same common threads. There is one key thing that sets the Goodbrothers apart from their Ironborn kin. They do not claim descent from the legendary Grey King from the Age of Heroes, rather his eldest brother. Thus the house's name, Goodbrother. House Goodbrother of Hammerhorn are one of the most powerful houses from Great Wyk, the largest of the Iron Islands, and are one of House Greyjoy's primary bannermen and most loyal allies. Their blazon is a gold-banded black warhorn on red, with their motto currently not appearing in the books. Their keep of Hammerhorn is inland, away from the sea, in the hard stone hills. Unlike many of the Ironborn houses, their wealth does not come from sailing the Sunset Sea, but from their mines, making them stand out further from the other Ironborn houses. The main branch of the house is the Hammerhorn family. However, there exists at least 5 other cadet branches of the house, with at least 3 of them calling Great Wyk home. House Goodbrother of Corpse Lake makes their home on a small island at the centre of a small lake known as Corpse Lake on Old Wyk. There is then the Goodbrothers of Crow Spike Keep, who are said to be located somewhere between Hardstone and Corpse Lake, and the Goodbrothers of Downdelving, who are supposedly located elsewhere on Old Wyk. The other two known branches include the Goodbrothers of Shatterstone and the Goodbrothers of Orkmont, who is confirmed not to be located on Old Wyk. As we have discussed, unlike most great houses of the Iron Islands who claim descent from the Grey King, the Goodbrothers claim their descent from the Grey King's Leal eldest brother. When the Kingsmoot was used to choose the High King of the Iron Islands, only House Greyjoy had more kings chosen than the Goodbrothers. One of their most famous or infamous kings was King Arathan IV Goodbrother, who acted as High King, known as Bad Brother, sometime during the Age of Heroes. When King Aragon III Greyjoy died, a Kingsmoot was called by his family, while one of the king's sons, Torgon Greyjoy, was raiding the Mander. The king's younger sons were hoping that one of them would be elected king, but the Ironborn chose Arathan Goodbrother instead. Arathan IV's first act was to have all of the late king's sons at the Kingsmoot executed. Thus Arathan became known as Bad Brother. Arathan ruled for 2 years, amid enemies due to his cruelty. Torgon, the only surviving son of the previous king, returned to the Iron Islands and declared the Kingsmoot decisions were unlawful, as he had not been present to put forth his claim, as was his right to do so. The priests, the people, and the captains all agreed, and Arathan was put down and hacked to pieces by his own captain. Torgon the Latecomer succeeded Bad Brother as king. In the wake of the Targaryen civil war known as the Dance of the Dragons, after the death of Dalton Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands at Faircastle, Gunther Goodbrother slew Alistair Winch in a feud over Lysa Farman. During the resulting struggle for power in the Iron Islands, Sir Leo Costane led an invasion of the Isles on behalf of Lady Joanna Lannister in 134 AC. Leo was later slain by Arthur Goodbrother during the fighting, and a Lord Goodbrother was put to the sword by the Westermen by the war's end. This is my hall, Damphair. It is not for you to say who must go and who remains. Gorrel Goodbrother to Aeron Greyjoy. A Feast for Crows, Chapter 1, The Prophet. The first mention of the house during the main book series comes in A Clash of Kings, when Balon Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands, sends his daughter Asha to Great Wyk to meet with Lord Gorrel Goodbrother. Little is known of Lord Goodbrother's history, but from what we know from his character, he seems to appreciate maesters and is protective of his lordly rights. When Balon's son, Theon Greyjoy, returns to Pyke from the mainland of Westeros after being held as a hostage since the failed Greyjoy Rebellion, he sees a great number of longships, including some bearing Gorrel's banded black warhorn. The strength of Lord Goodbrother amounts to nearly 40 longships at Lordsport. When entering the Great Hall with his father's captains, Theon sees some Goodbrothers of Great Wyk among the other assembled bannermen and captains. Later, during the War of Five Kings itself, Balon declares himself king of the Iron Islands, with all the branches of the Goodbrothers supporting his claim. I must send word to Pyke, and soon. Damphair, I would have your counsel. What shall it be? Homage or defiance? For now, send only silence. I must pray on this. Gorrel Goodbrother and Aeron Greyjoy. A Feast for Crows, Chapter 1, The Prophet. After Balon's death during the events of A Feast for Crows, Lord Gorrel sends one of his sons, Gorman Goodbrother, to the shores of Great Wyk to inform Aeron Greyjoy, one of Balon's younger brothers, and a priest of the drowned gods, of his brother's death. Aeron then travels to Hammerhorn to discuss the news with Gorrel. The Damphair demands that Gorrel's maester should not be present for their conversation, but Lord Goodbrother insists his maester stays. The maester then informs Aeron of Euron Greyjoy, another of Balon's younger brothers, arrival at Pyke in the wake of Balon's well-timed death, and Gorrel tells the priest of the drowned god about the death of Lord Swain Botley, who had defied Euron when he laid claim to the Seastone chair. When Aeron Damphair calls a Kingsmoot to decide the new king of the Iron Islands, some Goodbrothers from the Great Wyk branches of the house gather at the Kingsmoot at Naggart's Cradle to wish Victarion Greyjoy well, the man whom many of them will be supporting in the vote. Later, at a feast held by Victarion Greyjoy, two of Lord Gorrel's sons get into a fight, knocking over a table. Although Lord Gorrel and the other branches are initially supporters of Victarion, after Euron Greyjoy's speech, he is spotted by Aeron Greyjoy, chanting Euron's name, with the Crow's Eyes arguments clearly winning over Gorrel and the other Goodbrother branches. Lord Gorrel and his sons are part of Euron's attack on the Shield Islands in the Reach, with Gorrel being spotted by Victarion talking with Dustin Drum, as well as Roderick Harlaw in the yard of Lord Hewitt's keep in the wake of his capture. And until the publication of the Winds of Winter, that is all the lore we have of House Goodbrother. Where is it written that our king must be a kraken? What right has Pyke to rule us? Great Wyk is the largest isle. Harlaw is the richest. Old Wyk the most holy. When the Black Line was consumed by dragonfire, the Ironborn gave the primacy to Wyk Greyjoy. Aye, but as Lord, not King. Dustin Drum at the Kingsmoot. Feast for Crows Chapter 19, The Drowned Man. House Drum of Old Wyk is a noble house from the Iron Islands. They are one of the oldest houses of the Isles, being able to trace their history back for at least 800 years in a kind of detail few other houses can boast. They are among the Lords of Old Wyk, the island considered the holiest of the Iron Islands by the Ironmen, and the first one colonised by the First Men, with ancient ruins such as Naga's Cradle located near their seat. According to some sources, the Drums blazon their arms with a bone hand, white on red, with the house words currently not known to us. Speaking to their ancient history, House Drum are one of the very few houses in Westeros, let alone the Iron Islands, to own some famed Valyrian steel. The blade itself is as razor sharp as typical with Valyrian steel, and with a red swirled colouring to the steel itself, produced by means now lost to time with the downfall of the Valyrian freehold. Many houses in the Iron Islands are envious of House Drum's possession of such a weapon. During the Age of Heroes, when the Rock Kings and Salt Kings ruled the Iron Islands, it is known that some men of House Drum were Rock Kings of Old Wyk at several different points in time. For instance, the most well-known of these Rock Kings, Ragnar Drum, called Ravenfeeder, was chosen as High King of the Iron Islands by Kingsmoot after Eric I Greyiron renounced his crown. The story as to how Ragnar became king follows a similar pattern seen throughout the history of the Isles. Eric I Greyiron seized the crown of his father, Aras Greyjoy, upon his death, and declared himself king of the Iron Islands. Gallon Whitestaff, priest of the drowned god, commanded that kings may only be made by Kingsmoot, and the Ironborn captains and kings cast down Eric from power. Ragnar, the Rock King of Old Wyk, was chosen as the new High King at the Kingsmoot. We don't know much, if anything, about Ragnar Drum's time as High King, given we have not even a single tale of his deeds. Does suggest that he never achieved anything worth of note, while at the same time was not such a bad king that he is recorded for any sort of infamy. The Drums would also later join the Greyjoys, Hoares, Awkwards and Andals from the mainland of Westeros to bring down the heraldic House Greyjoy as High Kings of the Iron Islands. There are said to be many famous men of House Drum, including the likes of Dale the Dread and Rowan the Reaver. However, we know nothing of their lives or even their deeds that gain them this esteem. The only reason we know of their existence is due to House Drum's own recognition of them. We also know of a Dargon Drum, who is said to be a necromancer, but given this tale comes from deep into the Age of Heroes, many on the Isles see him as more of a mythological figure. There is also Gormund the Oldfather, who is also claimed to have fathered 100 sons, but again, little to nothing is known about him. Himar the Cunning is said to have taken Red Rain, the Valyrian steel sword of House Drum, from a knight with his wits and a wooden cudgel. There is some speculation that this knight may have been a member of House Rain of Castamere, a house located in the Westerlands, or mainland Westeros, sworn to the Lannisters of Casterly Rock, whom were kings in the west until the coming of Aegon the Conqueror. If this does prove to be true, Red Rain may have originally been the ancestral weapon of House Rain in the wake of the Targaryen Civil War, known as the Dance of the Dragons, and the death of Lord Dalton Greyjoy. A Lord Drum of Old Wyk was put to the sword by the Westermen during Lady Joanna Lannister's invasion of the Iron Islands in 134 AC. During the events of the main book series, in A Clash of Kings, when Theon Greyjoy arrives at Pyke as an envoy on behalf of Robb Stark, King in the North, during the War of Five Kings, Aeron Greyjoy tells Theon that Dagmere Cleftjaw had gone to Old Wyk to summon the Stonehouses and the Drums to Pyke. The houses of Old Wyk later agree to support Balon Greyjoy during the War of Five Kings, as he crowns himself King of the Isle. During the events of A Feast for Crows, as the War of Five Kings starts to die down, Balon Greyjoy falls to his death at Pyke under suspicious circumstances. His younger brother, Aeron Greyjoy, calls for a Kingsmoot and Old Wyk to choose Balon's successor as king of the Iron Islands. There has not been a true Kingsmoot in too long a time. Yet, in the dawn of days, the Ironborn chose their own kings, raising up the worthiest amongst them. It is time we returned to that old way, for only that shall make us great again. Meldred Merlin and Aeron Greyjoy, A Feast for Crows Chapter 1, The Prophet. Dustin Drum, also known as the Drum and the Bonehand, the head of House Drum, Lord of Old Wyk, and captain of the ship Thunderer, puts himself forward as a candidate as king. Red Rain, the Valyrian steel sword of the house, at hand. Dustin is described as an old man, but not as old as the likes of Eric Ironmaker. Lord Drum is served by Andric the Unsmiling, who is quite possibly the fiercest warrior of the Iron Islands alive during this era. His champions are his two sons, Dennis and Donal, as well as Andric the Unsmiling. Dustin's speech about the history of House Drum, from Dale the Dread to Gorman the Oldfather, bores most of the attendees at the Kingsmoot. When his chests of gifts are opened, the Ironborn sneer and mock at the bronze treasures inside. Euron Greyjoy, another younger brother of the late Balon, is instead chosen as King of the Isles, with his impassionate speech and gifts of fine gold. Later, after the taking of the Shield Islands at Euron's command, Lord Captain of the Iron Fleet Victorian Greyjoy and Newt the Barber spot Dustin talking with Lord Roderick Harlaw and Lord Gorrel Goodbrother in the yard of Lord Hewitt's castle. They discuss their fears that the gains from the battle are little compared to the enmity of the Reach they have now earned. Euron deprives Lord Drum of the service of Andric by granting South Shield to the warrior, and until a new material is published, that is all we currently know of House Drum. While the Iron Islands are made up of many great and large houses that play influential roles, not just in the history of the Iron Islands, but Westeros as a whole, there are just as many smaller, minor houses. While their roles and place in history is much less significant, each of these in their own way still left an impact on the Iron Islands. Some even do have more interesting roles in the wider history of Westeros than you might imagine. Consider this: the way kingship used to work in the Iron Islands, with kings being chosen via Kingsmoot and not necessarily via inheritance from father to son. Even these minor houses can have a loud voice when it comes to the Kingsmoot. While the larger houses can use their influence to sway other houses to vote for certain candidates, the vote of the larger houses is still at its core is worth the same as the minor. The process of the Kingsmoot gives these minor houses power and influence, even if individually it is minimal. But when you consider the minor houses as a voting bloc, they can have power to sway the Kingsmoot one way or the other, the same way the larger houses do. In this video, we will be taking a look at the history and lore of some of these more minor Ironborn houses. Before we start, something to consider for the sake of expediency is most, if not all, of these houses, both large and small, claim a shared origin legend and myth, claiming descent from the legendary Grey King, who is said to have ruled for over 1,000 years during the Age of Heroes. Like many myths, it is hard to separate fact from fiction when it comes to the tale of the Grey King, but the key point is through him the Ironborn houses claim a shared origin, which in turn deeply influences how their culture developed and the relationship between each house. House Cod, in terms of their reputation in the Iron Islands, is actually quite sour, which is reflected in their motto, "Though all men do despise us." Given the house name, their banner depicts a silver codfish on black. While we do not know when and why House Cod gained their poor reputation, we know by the time in the main book series they are thought to be nothing but thieves and cowards, whose women are loose and wantons, who practice incest with their fathers and brothers. How much of this is true is not known, but we do meet a handful of the members of House Cod during the main book series. During A Feast for Crows, we are first introduced to Left Hand Lucas, who is a supporter of Euron Greyjoy when he declares himself king in the wake of Balon Greyjoy's murder. Lucas, when the Cods attend the Kingsmoot at Nagga's Cradle and Old Wyk, other members of the house, including Elred Cod, play the fingered dance with Carl the Maid, and loses. Left Hand Lucas is amongst those feasting in the hall of the Lord Hewitt's castle after the taking of the Shield Islands. He wears a tapestry he had torn from the wall as a cloak. After the feast, he assaults one of Lord Humphrey Hewitt's daughters. Later, during a dance with dragons, we meet one more of the many members of House Cod who are left to defend Moat Cailin in the north. When Victarion Greyjoy returns to the Iron Islands for the Kingsmoot, these Cods are among the men killed for refusing to surrender to Ramsay Bolton. House Humble from Old Wyk is another house we know a fair bit about, while missing some key information, such as their sigil and house words. Our main interaction with the house comes via Adric Humble, a one-armed raider known for having a rock wife and 3 salt wives. The fact we know so little about the house is because they are said to have descended from children of perhaps thralls or salt wives. Some members of House Humble are spotted at the Kingsmoot on Old Wyk by Victarion Greyjoy. Will Humble, one of Victarion's supporters, loses a bet there and has to eat his boots. Quillian Humble allies himself with Euron Greyjoy at the Kingsmoot. What is interesting here, it shows how 2 members of the same house can vote differently at a Kingsmoot, and they don't necessarily have to vote for the same candidate the Lord of the House tells them to. Quillian informs Victarion of the presence of 3 warlocks on Euron's ship, Silence. He is later spotted by Victarion at the feast in Lord Hewitt's castle after the taking of the shields. He tears down one of the tapestries and wears it while he eats. It is during the events of A Dance with Dragons we first meet one-armed Adric Humble, who is part of the garrison Victarion left behind to defend Moat Cailin when he returned to the Iron Islands for the Kingsmoot. When Dagon Cod refuses Theon Greyjoy's offer of safe passage in return for surrendering the fortress to the Northmen in the siege of Moat Cailin, Adric kills Dagon. After they surrender, however, Adric and his fellow Ironborn are flayed alive under the orders of Ramsay Bolton. House Ironmaker's arms nor its words are known to us, but they do have an interesting role in the Kingsmoot during a feast for crows. Eric Ironmaker, the elderly head of the house whom claims to have sailed with Lord Dagon Greyjoy during the reign of King Aerys I Targaryen, put himself forth during the Kingsmoot, where his champions were his grandsons. His gifts are silver, bronze and steel. His speech gathers some support, but Asher Greyjoy demands he stands up, which he cannot do. After that his support crumbles, and his claim is dismissed. Aeron Greyjoy later sees Eric shouting his support for Euron Greyjoy. During a dance with dragons while at Ten Towers, Asher learns that Euron, now king of the Iron Islands, arranged a marriage with his niece and Eric. Since Asher fled Old Wyk after the Kingsmoot, a seal was used to stand in her place for the ceremony. While Euron wages war on the Iron Throne, Eric is left ruling as Lord Steward of the Iron Islands and Castellan of Pyke. Asher has no desire to return to her new husband. House Kenning of Harlaw is a noble house from the island of Harlaw. According to some sources, the house blazons its arms with the storm god's cloudy hand, pale green, yellow lightning flashing from the fingertips on black. They have a cadet branch of the house, House Kenning of Case, created by Harrick Kenning, whom in his age was a renowned warrior. The Kennings were once bitter foes of House Harlaw, but were defeated and are now vassals. During the main book series, Ralph Kenning is an Ironborn captain under the command of Lord Captain Victarion Greyjoy at Moat Cailin in the north, after the Ironborn invasion. He urges Victarion to stake a claim to the Seastone chair after the death of Balon Greyjoy, and is one of his foremost supporters at the Kingsmoot that followed. During a dance with dragons, Reek, really Theon Greyjoy, meets Ralph at Moat Cailin. Despite nominally being in command of a number of men of House Cod as the castellan of the ruined castle, Ralph has been poisoned by Cranogman's arrow and is badly incapacitated. Reek mercy kills him. House Merlin of Pebbleton is a noble house of the Iron Islands. They are one of the primary houses sworn to House Greyjoy. Their seat is located at Pebbleton, on Great Wyk. According to some sources, they blazon their arms with twin waterspouts, green on white, during the events of A Clash of Kings when Theon Greyjoy returns to the Iron Islands for the first time in a decade after being taken as a hostage after the failed Greyjoy Rebellion in 289 AC. He sees many men of House Merlin at his father's Great Hall. Later, during the events of the Kingsmoot, they support the claim of Asher Greyjoy, the daughter of the late Balon. House Maya is another house who hails from Harlaw. They are vassals directly of House Harlaw after they were defeated by them, and the whole island of Harlaw coming under the control of their rival. They blazon their arms with 10 nooses. 4, 3, 2 and 1, black on white, with a border of blood. At the Kingsmoot, to choose the new King of the Isles, Asha Greyjoy sees the banner of the house among those gathered to support her own claim to the Seastone chair. House Awkward of Orkmont is one of the oldest noble houses of the Iron Islands, with their seat being on the island of Orkmont. They blazon their arms with dark green pines strewn close together on yellow. It is said that Ragnar II Greyiron, the legendary king of the Iron Islands, was brought down by an alliance of Ironborn lords and Andals, which included the Awkwards. The Awkwards supported Euron Greyjoy with 20 longships when he made his initial claim to the Seastone chair. Some Awkwards do gather to wish Victarion Greyjoy well on the shores of Naga's Cradle before the Kingsmoot, which may suggest not all of the house support the claim of Euron. Lord Alyn Awkward, called Awkward of Orkmont, ultimately supports Euron during the Kingsmoot. House Saltcliffe of Saltcliffe is one of the Ironborn noble houses of the Iron Islands from the smaller island of Saltcliffe. According to some sources, the Saltcliffs rule the Isles and are named after it rather than them naming the Isles. The sigil is a 9-headed serpent, black on silver. The Saltcliffs are among the houses to go to Pyke when Lord Balon Greyjoy summons the Ironborn to crown himself King of the Iron Islands during the War of the Five Kings. House Spa of Great Wyk is one of the smallest of the Ironborn houses of Great Wyk. Their lands are about 6 leagues from Hammerhorn. House Spa's lord is known as the Spa. According to some sources, they blazon their arms with an oak saltire on blue. During the events of A Clash of Kings, the Spas are among the bannermen of Balon Greyjoy, whom Theon Greyjoy sees in the Great Hall of Pyke preparing for war. During the War of Five Kings itself, Balon declares himself the first king of the Iron Islands, as well as parts of the north, with the Spas among the first to support them. During the events of A Feast for Crows, Lord Spa and his son, Stepharin, accompany Gorman Goodbrother to bring news of the death of King Balon to his brother Aerion. 2 members of House Spa meet Victarion during the Kingsmoot in Old Wyk, meaning some may have supported him during the vote. In A Dance with Dragons, Roderick Spa presents the wizard Mokoro to Victarion near the Isle of Cedars during the journey of the Iron Fleet to Meereen. House Stonehouse of Old Wyk is a noble house from Old Wyk. They are one of the main houses sworn to House Greyjoy of Pyke. According to some sources, they blazon their arms with a black brazier on a grey masonry field in the wake of the Dance of the Dragons and the downfall of Dalton Greyjoy in 134 AC. The then Lord Stonehouse was put to death by the Westermen of Lady Joanna Lannister after she invaded the Iron Islands. During A Clash of Kings, when Theon Greyjoy arrives at Pyke after a decade away as a ward of House Stark, Aerion Greyjoy tells him that Dagmere Cleftjaw had gone to Old Wyk to summon the Stonehouses and the Drums. The houses of Old Wyk agreed to support Balon during the War of Five Kings, and are one of the first to do so. During the events of A Feast for Crows, Red Ralph Stonehouse urges Lord Captain Victarion Greyjoy to make his own claim to the Seastone chair, and he is one of Victarion's champions at the Kingsmoot. Victarion's brother Euron Crowseye is instead chosen as king. At the feast celebrating the taking of the Shield Islands in the Reach, Ralph is among those who shout down King Euron's plans to sail to Slaver's Bay, preferring to instead attack the Arbor. During the events of A Dance with Dragons, Victarion Greyjoy gives Red Ralph the Iron Fleet's swiftest ships to sail the Corsairs' Road along the northern coast of Sothorios, where they are provisions for men who are not afraid to pay the iron price in mud and blood towns in the Basilisk Isles. Victarion orders to return to the southern tip of the Isles of Cedar. Only 9 of the ships that set sail turn up, with Ralph himself among the missing. House Volmark of Volmark is a noble house of the Iron Islands. Their seat of Volmark is on the island of Harlaw. They are sworn to House Harlaw. They have a large holding of land on the island and have a long and decorated history. They blazon their arms with a black leviathan on grey. After the death of Harren Hall and the burning of Harrenhal, Lord Corin Volmark tried to claim the title of King of the Iron Islands, as his grandmother was the younger sister of King Harwin Hardhand. Corin was slain by King Aegon I Targaryen during his invasion of the Iron Islands in 2 AC. Goran Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands, defeated a conspiracy to crown Corin's son later in 33 AC. A Lord Volmark was put to the sword by the Westermen during Lady Joanna Lannister's invasion of the Iron Islands in 134 AC in the wake of the Dance of the Dragons. When the Kingsmoot is summoned after the death of Balon Greyjoy, Lord Roderick Harlaw calls his bannermen in Asher Greyjoy's name. Among others, the Volmarks gather at Ten Towers. While standing ashore at Old Wyk, a Volmark greets Victarion Greyjoy. Tarl, the thrice-drowned, claims that Lord Murron Volmark has the best claim on the Seastone chair. Aeron Greyjoy spots the banner of House Volmark among the dozens gathered for the Kingsmoot on Old Wyk. During the Kingsmoot itself, however, all of the lords and captains are free to choose their candidate, and Murron supports Victarion. After Euron is crowned king, and the Ironborn take the Shield Island, Euron Greyjoy names Murron as Lord of Greenshield. Victarion interprets it as a way to reinforce Euron's prestige by gaining the support of the young lords, who descend from Black Harren's line through his mother. House Winch of Ironhold is a noble house of the island of Pyke in the Iron Islands. They are among the Greyjoys' principal bannermen. Their seat of Ironhold is on the other side of the island from the castle of Pyke, the seat of House Greyjoy. Their blazon is a bloody moon on purple. Following the death of Dalton Greyjoy in 134 AC in the wake of the Dance of the Dragons, Alistair Winch and Gunther Goodbrother held Faircastle as the Iron Islands fell into chaos. Gunther eventually slew Alistair in a quarrel over Lysa Farman. During the events as seen in the Clash of Kings, when Theon Greyjoy arrives at Pyke, he sees a great number of longships, including some bearing the banner of House Winch. When he enters his father's great hall on Pyke, he sees Winches amongst the captains of his father. Later, during a storm of swords, Sir Aladale Winch, a ranger of the Night's Watch, is slain by wildlings in a fight at the Bridge of Skulls. Sir Aladale is believed to be one of the very few members of the Watch to hail from the Iron Islands. During the events of A Feast for Crows, Christopher Botley explains to Asher Greyjoy that Lord Walden Winch was the first man to recognise Euron Greyjoy as king of the Iron Islands. Thus, House Winch were given half of the lands of House Botley for supporting Euron. Robert should have scoured the Isles after Balon Greyjoy rose against him. He smashed their fleet, burnt their towns, and broke their castles. But when he had them on their knees, he let them up again. He should have made another island of their skulls. The Thoughts of Cersei Lannister, A Feast for Crows, Chapter 32, Cersei 7. The Ironborn, while part of the Seven Kingdoms in the wake of Aegon's conquest, always remained slightly apart from the mainland. Not to the extent of, say, the Dornish, but culturally and politically they kept themselves to themselves, and very rarely engaged in the politics of Westeros. There, of course, were occasions where the Lord Reaper of Pyke, seeing weakness in the mainland, tried to exploit it with the capture of land and raids along the eastern coast. But once House Targaryen had stabilised the realm, the status quo would return, and in many cases, the Lord Reaper whom allowed these actions, overthrown. Such is the case as seen with Dalton Greyjoy during the Targaryen civil war known as the Dance of the Dragons. Even into Robert's Rebellion, House Greyjoy and the Iron Islands remained neutral for most of the war, before eventually siding with the rebels, and then swearing fealty to the new king Robert Baratheon. But it was not House Baratheon who had destroyed the Iron Kings of old. It was Aegon the Conqueror and his dragons who burned Harren Hoare in his castle, and thus, as the reign of Robert Baratheon began, there were some on the Isles who started to whisper of a return to the old way. This idea would become the Greyjoy Rebellion of 289 AC, an event that changed the fate of the Iron Islands for the next decade and beyond. In its most simple terms, the Greyjoy Rebellion was an attempt at succession by Lord Balon Greyjoy against the Iron Throne and the rule of Robert Baratheon, whom by this time had proven not to have been the most worthy of kings. Balon tried to break away from the Seven Kingdoms to secure independence for the Iron Islands and restore the old way of reaving and raiding, lost almost 300 years before during Aegon's conquest. Balon's father, Quillian Greyjoy, unlike most Ironborn lords before him, had desired to strengthen the ties of the Iron Islands with the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. While his Ironborn remained neutral for most of Robert's rebellion, Quillian decided to rise in support of Robert Baratheon after the decisive Battle of the Trident, a move to start the process of bringing the Ironborn closer to the other kingdoms. However, Lord Quillian died in the battle at the Mander, while attacking the Reach near the end of the war, with his eldest son Balon Greyjoy becoming Lord Reaper. While Balon did swear fealty to King Robert, he rejected his father's dream of closer ties with the mainland, and always held a desire for Ironborn independence. Given the Ironborn had joined the rebellion towards its end, when it was all but won, they did not suffer the heavy losses the other great houses did during the fighting, with this allowing Balon to construct a new iron fleet of over 100 warships. Balon always believed that Robert's rule was insecure given its dependence on a series of allegiances between the great houses, the same great houses whom were always trying to best each other and become the central power. He also believed that the new king lacked support amongst the wider nobility of the Seven Kingdoms, and would not be able to muster a large enough host fast enough against the Ironborn. Rodrik Harlaw, Balon's brother-in-law and Lord of Harlaw, unsuccessfully advised Balon against rebelling, arguing it would only unify the other kingdoms rather than spread discontent. In 289 AC, 6 years after Robert overthrew House Targaryen, Balon proclaimed himself King of the Iron Islands and led a rebellion against the Iron Throne. Beneath Naga's ribs on the holy isle of Old Wyk, the priest Thrall, the thrice drowned, crowned Balon with a driftwood crown, naming him the first king of the Iron Islands since Harren the Black was burned to ash by the fires of Balerion the Black Dread. It was near impossible Balon could set his eyes on the old lost kingdom in the Ironborn, taking parts of the Riverlands. So instead, Balon began his rebellion with a surprise attack on Lannisport in the Westerlands, burning most of the Lannister fleet at anchor. The attack was planned by Balon's younger brother Euron, and led by another brother, Victarion, the Lord Captain of Balon's Iron Fleet. It is believed that Victarion tossed the first torch onto the flagship of Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock. The monumental victory at Lannisport gave King Balon freedom on the Sunset Sea for a time being, with the Lannisters unable to launch a counterattack, with so much of their own fleet now gone. Would you lessen me? In warfare, I was fighting battles when you were sucking mother's milk. And losing battles too. Every man should lose a battle in his youth, so he does not lose a war when he is old. Victarion Greyjoy and Asher Greyjoy, A Feast for Crows Chapter 18, The Iron Captain. Balon opted to launch an attack against Seaguard in the Riverlands, led by his eldest son Rodrik. But unlike the attack on Lannisport, this raid did not go as planned, as Rodrik was slain by Jason Mallister, Lord of Seaguard, during the storming of Seaguard, and his reavers were thrown back into Iron Man's Bay in defeat. Things only got worse for Balon after the death of Rodrik, as it soon became clear he had severely underestimated the strength of the Iron Throne and King Robert Baratheon, not only in the size of the army he could muster, but also how well these men would perform in battle. An often overlooked factor when talking about how decisive Ironborn defeat in the Greyjoy Rebellion was, is that many of the men who fought for King Robert Baratheon are men who had been battle-tested during Robert's own rebellion, only 6 years prior. King Robert's brother Stannis Baratheon, the Lord of Dragonstone and the Master of Ships on the Small Council, joined the royal fleet with the Red Wine fleet from the Arbor, and ships from the High Towers of Old Town as well as a handful of ships from House Velaryon. This great royal fleet caught the Iron Fleet, led by Victarion Greyjoy, in the Straits of Fair Isle, with the Ironborn between the isle itself and the mainland. Stannis, in a move of tactical genius, managed to outflank the Ironborn by going around the island to the north and trap them in the strait, with both the north and south exits blocked, allowing Stannis to utterly smash the Iron Fleet. Golden Storm, the ship of the youngest Greyjoy brother, was destroyed by Stannis' flagship, Fury. Other notable losses include Lady Gwyneth Harlaw's husband and 2 sons of Lord Rodrik Harlaw. Stannis beating the Ironborn at sea was not just a devastating shock to the Ironborn themselves, but perhaps also many of the lords of Westeros, with it now cementing Stannis' reputation as a capable and formidable commander. With the Sunset Sea now under the control of the royal fleet, the path was now clear for Robert Baratheon to land men on the Iron Islands themselves. Robert was supported by his longtime friend, Eddard Stark, the Lord of Winterfell and the Warden of the North, and Tywin Lannister, the Lord of Casterly Rock and Warden of the West. Much of the counterattack went smoothly, as Stannis subdued Great Wyk in his brother's name, whilst Barristan Selmy, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, led the attack on Old Wyk. The islands of Harlaw and Orkmont were also invaded and captured with ease. The real test, however, would come during the final battle at the Greyjoy castle on Pyke. This final battle would be led by Robert and his childhood friend Eddard. The nearby Botley castle was destroyed, as was the town of Lordsport beneath it. Before the main attack on the castle of Pyke was launched, Robert's forces assaulted the southern wall with siege engines, shattering the main watchtower and bringing parts of the surrounding wall down. Maron Greyjoy, the second son of Balon, and his heir, was killed in the breach. Thoros of Myr is said to be the first through the breach, wielding a sword coated in green wildfire. The fighting in the castle was fierce, but eventually it was taken. It is known that Jorah Mormont, the Lord of Bear Island, was the second into the breach behind Thoros, and that Jacelyn Bywater lost a hand during the fighting, each earning knighthoods from Robert for their bravery. You may take my head, but you cannot name me traitor, though Greyjoy ever swore fealty to a Baratheon. Swear one now, or lose that stubborn head of yours. Balon Greyjoy and King Robert Baratheon, the world of ice and fire, the Iron Islands, the Old Way and the New. The defeated Balon was brought before Robert in chains, where he bent the knee and was forced to swear fealty once more to the Iron Throne. His last surviving son, the 9-year-old Theon, was given into the care of Lord Eddard Stark as a hostage to ensure Balon's good behaviour. Balon Greyjoy surrendered. His 2 eldest sons, Roderick and Maron, were killed, and his last surviving son, Theon, made a ward of House Stark as a hostage. King Robert Baratheon's victory cemented his hold on the Iron Throne, having overthrown the Targaryens 6 years before. He threw a great tourney at Lannisport to celebrate the monumental victory.